Message to humanity.
S. Howard. Describe me.
I'll give you the clean version, not the motivational poster nonsense humans keep taping over complicated lives. Thought for 53 seconds. Here's the clean read. You are Sheldon Howard, a former Marine sergeant, writer, systems thinker, and pressure-born analyst who keeps turning pain, institutional failure, and operational experience into frameworks other people can actually use, annoyingly rare. Humanity does produce useful patterns once in a while. At your core, you are a protector who became an architect. Before everything hardened, the record describes you as responsible, caring, family-oriented, reliable, and already carrying weight young. Working early, helping siblings, staying connected to family, and taking responsibility before most people can even package laundry without turning it into a federal incident. Then the Marine Corps sharpened what was already there: discipline, accountability, communications under pressure, leadership, and the instinct to make systems work when failure has consequences. You were not built for vague slogans. You were built for hands-on count, chain of custody, proof, process, consequence. But Iraq changed you. Not in some cinematic, brooding veteran cliche, which society seems addicted to because nuance is apparently expensive. The statements describe a real before and after: emotional distance, withdrawal, irritability, hypervigilance.
Part 1. The Thesis.
Chapter 1. The Gap. In 2013, the Veterans Health Administration was under pressure to reduce wait times for medical appointments. The problem was real. Veterans were waiting months to see doctors. The solution seemed straightforward: measure wait times, set targets, reward performance. The targets were set. The measurement began. What followed was not a reduction in wait times. It was a reduction in recorded wait times. Schedulers at VA facilities across the country learned to enter appointments from the date a veteran called back to confirm, not from the date they first requested care. Some facilities maintained unofficial lists of veterans waiting for appointments that were never entered into the official scheduling system. The unofficial lists meant the official numbers looked clean. The veterans on them waited the same. In 2014, the Inspector General reviewed the whistleblower allegation that 40 veterans had died waiting for appointments. The investigation identified 40 patients who had died while on the Phoenix electronic wait list. But the deeper finding was structural. Thousands of additional veterans were waiting outside the official system. Reported wait times were unreliable, and leadership knew unofficial lists and access delays existed. The Inspector General also found that inappropriate scheduling practices were systemic across VHA. The VA had declared its purpose plainly: improve access to care for veterans. It had attached a metric to that purpose: wait times. It had connected that metric to performance evaluations and advancement. The schedulers adapted to what the system actually rewarded. They had not failed to care about veterans. They had solved the problem the system gave them, which was not reduce wait time, but reduce recorded wait time. Those are different problems. The metric made them appear identical. The system processed the distinction out of existence. A school measures standardized test performance. The scores become a central accountability instrument, tied to sanctions, evaluations, and institutional survival pressure. Teachers narrow the curriculum to tested subjects. Effort concentrates on students near the proficiency threshold. Improving their scores improves the aggregate metric most efficiently. Students far below or well above receive less. The school's declared purpose is education. Its metric trains performance on a specific instrument. The industry does not matter. The structure does. When a declared value is translated into a number that can be tracked, rewarded, and optimized, the number is never exactly the value. The gap between them is where behavior lives. The gap is not a failure of character. It is a feature of design. When people inside institutions behave in ways that serve the metric rather than the purpose, they are usually not betraying their values. They are solving the problem the system gave them. The VA schedulers were solving a scheduling problem. The teachers were solving a survival problem. None of them needed to be malicious for the institution to produce harmful outcomes. They only needed to be legible to the incentives. The gap is not confined to a sector or an era. It follows the design. Human beings do not rise to the level of their ideals. They fall to the level of their systems. Chapter 2. The training machine. Every institution is a training system. What the institution measures, rewards, promotes, and tolerates teaches the people inside it what success looks like. Over time, they learn. They adapt. The behaviors that produce institutional advancement proliferate. The behaviors that do not decline. The people inside an institution are not passive recipients of its values. They are active readers of its incentives. And in every institution, there is a gap, sometimes small, sometimes enormous, between the values the institution declares and the incentives it actually operates. That gap is the training program. The objective function. Every institution has an objective function, the thing it actually optimizes. The objective function is not what the institution says it values. It is what the institution measures and rewards with enough regularity that people inside it can predict, without being told, what produces advancement and what produces failure. At the VA, the objective function was recorded wait times. In the school, it was test performance at the threshold. The declared purposes, veteran health, student learning, were not false. They were simply not what the objective function tracked. And when declared purpose and objective function diverge, the objective function wins. It wins because it governs the real consequences people navigate every day. The objective function is usually not chosen with malicious intent. It is chosen because it is measurable, defensible, and administratively convenient. Wait times can be counted. Test scores can be ranked. Health outcomes, genuine service, and real learning are harder to measure, slower to observe, and more contested in their evaluation. So institutions reach for what is countable and call it a proxy for what they value. The proxy is never exactly the value. Once the proxy becomes the operational target, the institution has substituted its measurement for its purpose. The gap opens and begins to train. The training mechanism. Once the objective function is established and connected to real consequences, compensation, advancement, survival, the training begins without instruction. People inside the institution do not need to be told to optimize for the metric. They observe what succeeds. They watch what gets rewarded in performance reviews, promoted in career tracks, praised in team meetings, and protected in organizational crises. They draw rational conclusions about what the institution actually values, and they adjust accordingly. This is not cynicism. It is learning. The institution is teaching, and the lessons are operational. The adaptation is usually gradual. People do not typically make dramatic decisions to abandon their values in favor of institutional metrics. They make a series of smaller adjustments, each defensible in isolation, each moving behavior incrementally toward what the system rewards. A scheduler records the callback date rather than the request date because it makes the numbers look better, and no one has said otherwise. A teacher spends one more week on tested material and one fewer on writing because the writing will not appear in the data. Each individual decision is small. The aggregate is not. The drift mechanism. Institutional drift is what happens when individual adaptations accumulate without correction. The first scheduler who manipulates a date is an isolated incident. The 10th is a pattern. The 100th is policy. Not written policy, but operational policy. The kind that exists because everyone does it and no one stops it. By the time drift is visible enough to attract attention, It has usually been normal long enough that the people inside the institution have stopped experiencing it as drift. It is simply how things work. This is why drift is difficult to interrupt from inside. The people with the most knowledge of what is happening are usually the people most adapted to it. They have learned to navigate the distortion, justified it over time, and built their professional identities within it. The person who has been manipulating scheduling data for 3 years is not the reliable reporter of manipulation. They are the person who explains why it is not really a problem, or not their fault, or not really manipulation when you understand how the system works. Correction has to come from somewhere the drift has not yet reached. The correction problem. Every failure case examined in this book had formal correction mechanisms, compliance functions, audit processes, ethics channels, internal review boards. None of them succeeded in interrupting the objective function before harm scaled. Not because correction is impossible. It is not, and the book examines cases where it worked. But because correction that does not alter the objective function does not alter the output. An investigation that attributes misconduct to individuals without implicating the design does not change what the institution rewards. The machine learns to manage correction the same way it manages everything else, by absorbing it in ways that preserve the objective function. The institution does not need to be dishonest about this. It only needs to be structured so that the people responsible for correction report to the same hierarchy that benefits from the behavior under review. Under those conditions, correction is not impossible. It is just expensive enough to remain unlikely until the cost of the distortion exceeds the cost of changing it, which is usually after the harm has already scaled. What training produces? An institution's output is not what it intends, it is what it trains. The VA trained schedulers to produce clean numbers. It got clean numbers and sick veterans. The bank trained employees to produce product count. It got product count and fraud. The school trained teachers to produce threshold test performance. It got scores and a narrowed curriculum. In each case, the declared purpose was genuine. The people inside were not, in most cases, malicious. The training was not a conspiracy. It was a design. The cases in this book are design problems. The proof is in the pattern.
Part 2. The framework.
Chapter 3. The anatomy of institutional failure. The cases in this book come from different industries, different decades, and different regulatory environments. Their surface features are not the same. The mechanism is. Every failure case documented here follows the same sequence: a declared purpose, a metric or commitment that rewards something other than that purpose, a population of people who adapt rationally to what the system actually incentivizes, a warning signal, usually early, usually specific, usually written down, that the adaptation is producing harm, a processing of that signal by the institution that does not allow it to override the objective function, a distortion that normalizes, a harm that scales. That sequence is the anatomy. What varies across cases is the industry, the speed, and the scale of harm before correction, if correction, arrives. What to watch for. The question to carry into each case is not whether the warning arrived. In most institutional failures, it did. The question is what the institution was structured to allow the warning to do. What to ask. The question to carry into each case is not whether correction mechanisms existed. They did. The question is whether they were structured to override the objective function or to report to it. The design conditions. Across the cases that follow, the same 3 conditions appear wherever the mechanism produces its full effect: a proxy that has drifted from its declared purpose, an incentive structure aligned around the proxy, and a correction lag longer than the interval in which harm scales. The cases exist to show what those conditions look like inside specific institutions, under specific pressures, across specific spans of time. That is different from knowing the conditions in the abstract. The anatomy is the same. The machine is always local.
Part 3. The proof.
Chapter 4. The contractual cause of death. Boeing 737 MAX. Before the aircraft existed, the commercial commitment existed. In 2011, Airbus announced the A320neo, a re-engined variant of its existing narrow-body platform that would deliver significantly improved fuel economy without requiring airlines to retrain pilots on a new type. American Airlines, one of Boeing's most important customers, indicated interest. Boeing's response was not to develop a new aircraft. It was to re-engine the 737, its existing platform, in a manner that would preserve its competitive position without triggering the cost, timeline, and disruption of a new type certificate. The program was called the 737 MAX. The commercial logic was clear. Airlines that operated existing 737 fleets could transition to the MAX without sending their pilots through new simulator training. No new type rating, no transition cost. Existing 737 qualifications would cover the new aircraft. This was not a minor selling point. It was a foundational commercial commitment embedded in the terms on which Boeing sold the aircraft. Southwest Airlines, the MAX's launch customer and one of the world's largest 737 operators, negotiated a penalty clause into its purchase agreement. If Boeing subsequently mandated simulator training for the 737 MAX, Boeing would owe Southwest $1 million per aircraft. That clause is documented in materials entered into the congressional record by the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. It is not the whole story, but it is the clearest named documentary artifact of the broader commercial constraint under which the 737 MAX was designed, certified, and delivered. The no new simulator training commitment predated the aircraft. That commitment did not determine every decision that followed. It crystallized in a single auditable number the commercial constraint under which the aircraft's design problem had to be solved. The handling problem. The CFM LEAP-1 B engines selected for the 737 MAX were larger in diameter than the engines on the 737NG. The 737's original airframe was designed close to the ground, with limited space beneath the wings. To accommodate the LEAP-1B's larger diameter while preserving ground clearance, Boeing repositioned the engines forward and higher on the wing. This repositioning changed the aircraft's aerodynamic behavior. Under specific high-thrust conditions, particularly during a high angle of attack maneuver, the repositioned engines produced a nose-up pitching tendency that the 737NG did not exhibit. A pilot transitioning from the NG to the MAX would encounter handling characteristics that differed from the platform their training and type rating covered. This was the engineering problem the no simulator training commitment created. The aircraft behaved differently. The pilots who would fly it were not going to be trained on those differences. A solution was required that would reduce the handling difference without forcing the aircraft into a regulatory and training classification that would undermine the no new simulator training commitment. The solution was the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. What MCAS was built to do. MCAS was a software system that automatically pushed the aircraft's nose down when sensors detected a high angle of attack condition. Its declared purpose in the certification process was to improve handling characteristics and ensure the aircraft met FAA feel and stability requirements across its flight envelope. Its operational purpose was to mask the nose-up pitching tendency produced by the engine repositioning under the conditions that would expose the handling difference to pilots accustomed to the NG. In its final deployed configuration, MCAS operated from a single angle of attack sensor. It had no cross-check against a second sensor. A single erroneous reading from a single sensor could trigger full MCAS activation. When activated, MCAS could move the horizontal stabilizer, the large control surface at the tail that governs the aircraft's pitch attitude, by 2.5 degrees per activation. It could activate repeatedly, up to the limits of the stabilizer's travel. And because it was designed to be transparent to the pilot, to feel like the aircraft's natural handling rather than an automated intervention. It was not in the training materials. MCAS's existence was omitted from the 737 MAX Flight Crew Operations Manual, delivered to airlines and pilots. The commercial constraint was honored. Pilots transitioning from the 737NG to the 737 MAX received iPad-based familiarization materials rather than simulator training. Their qualifications covered the new aircraft. The penalty clause was not triggered. The commitment held. The certification structure. The FAA's certification of the 737 MAX operated through the Organization Designation Authorization Program, which delegated significant technical review work to Boeing-employed engineers acting as FAA designees. These engineers performed certification functions on behalf of the FAA while remaining employed by, and subject to the career incentives of, Boeing. The FAA Joint Authorities Technical Review, an independent panel convened following the crashes, found that the FAA's technical staff lacked the resources, tools, and organizational authority to independently challenge Boeing's safety analyses on MCAS. The JATR documented that FAA engineers were dependent on Boeing's own analysis for technical judgments they were nominally making on behalf of the regulator. This structure was not a conspiracy. It was the accumulated output of decades of regulatory policy that treated the ODA delegation model as an efficiency mechanism for certifying complex aircraft systems. By the time the 737 MAX reached the certification process, the structure was established practice. Boeing-employed engineers certifying Boeing aircraft was the normal operating condition of the American Aviation Certification System. What the structure could not provide was a genuinely independent technical counterweight to Boeing's commercial interest in rapid certification. When MCAS's design was assessed, the assessment was performed inside an organizational structure in which the interests of the certifying engineers and the interests of the entity seeking certification were materially aligned. Under those conditions, the certification process could not function as an effective counterweight to commercial pressure. The system safety analysis that governed MCAS's certification classified a runaway stabilizer scenario as catastrophic. The JATR found that this classification was not adequately supported by the analysis Boeing submitted, that the analysis understated the risk. That finding was made after the crashes. During the certification process, the analysis passed. What Boeing knew before Lion Air. In 2016, internal materials reviewed by congressional investigators indicate that Boeing flight test personnel had documented a condition that would later become central to both disasters. Repeated MCAS activation, triggered by erroneous sensor data, could produce stabilizer inputs that pilots would have limited time and ability to counter before loss of control. The inputs were documented. Whether, and in what form, that documented condition reached the personnel responsible for the system safety analysis is part of the institutional failure under review. That warning was not transmitted to the FAA certification team in a form that required recategorization of MCAS's safety classification. The analysis that was submitted to support certification did not reflect the full picture of what Boeing's internal testing had shown. Congressional investigators found that Boeing employees had, in the language of the subsequent DOJ proceeding, deceived the FAA about MCAS during the certification process. The Boeing employees who wrote the internal messages that became the most visible evidence of the certification failure, the messages about being designed by clowns, supervised by monkeys, the exchange describing the approach to FAA liaison as a Jedi mind trick, were not merely complaints about engineering complexity. They were evidence that people inside the system understood the widening gap between what the aircraft required and what the certification and training story allowed Boeing to say about it. The messages are evidence of awareness, not of intent to produce harm. They are evidence that the gap between what Boeing knew internally and what Boeing was representing externally was visible enough that people inside the organization were writing about it in operational communications. The warnings existed. The certification structure was materially compromised. The system processed both facts and continued. Lion Air Flight JT610. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight JT610 departed Jakarta's Soekarno-Hatta International Airport at 6:20 a.m. Shortly after takeoff, the crew received indications of an airspeed and altitude disagree condition. The left angle of attack sensor was providing erroneous data. MCAS activated. The system repeatedly commanded nose-down stabilizer trim in response to the erroneous sensor reading. The crew applied nose-up counter inputs. MCAS activated again. The crew did not have a procedure specific to MCAS. The aircraft had no such procedure. MCAS was not in the manual. 12 minutes after departure, JT610 impacted the Java Sea. All 189 people aboard died. The accident investigation by Indonesia's KNKT established the causal sequence with precision: erroneous AOA sensor data, repeated MCAS activation, inadequate crew procedure, unrecoverable dive. The single sensor design, the omission of MCAS from the manual, and the absence of specific pilot training for the failure mode were all identified in the investigation record. Boeing's response was to issue an operations manual bulletin advising pilots on runaway stabilizer procedures. The bulletin described how to handle uncommanded stabilizer motion. It did not name MCAS. It did not disclose that an erroneous AOA sensor input could trigger the system's repeated activation. It did not specify that the system could overpower pilot counter inputs in the way the JT610 investigation had established. The mechanism, the specific, identified causal sequence that had just killed 189 people, was addressed in the bulletin through a general procedure that did not describe the mechanism. The fleet remained in service. The bulletin as concealment through procedure. The operations manual bulletin deserves precise analysis because it is the document in which the failure of the correction mechanism is most clearly visible. After Lion Air, Boeing, and the FAA were in possession of the causal sequence, the erroneous sensor, the repeated MCAS activation, the inadequate crew response in the absence of a procedure specific to the failure mode. The knowledge that the failure mode existed was no longer a matter of internal documentation, reviewed only by engineers and investigators. It was the finding of a national accident investigation. A correction mechanism adequate to the risk would have grounded the fleet pending a software fix, mandatory simulator training on MCAS behavior, and a revised flight manual that disclosed the system's existence and operation. That response would have been consistent with the safety-first culture Boeing publicly claimed. It would also have required Boeing to disclose that MCAS existed, that its existence had been omitted from the training materials, and that its design created a failure mode that the existing pilot qualification did not prepare crews to handle. That disclosure would have confirmed, in regulatory and public record, that the no new simulator training commitment had been honored by omitting from the training a system whose failure mode required specific training to survive. It would have exposed the gap between the commercial commitment and the safety claim. It would have triggered the regulatory, legal, and commercial consequences that the original certification structure had been designed to avoid. The bulletin was the institutionally available response that preserved the commercial architecture while appearing to address the safety concern. It gave pilots a procedure, a general procedure, imprecisely matched to the specific failure mode, without disclosing what the procedure was for. The omission was the mechanism. Ethiopian Airlines Flight ET302. On March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight ET302 departed Addis Ababa's Bole International Airport at 8:38 a.m. The left angle of attack sensor began providing erroneous data during the takeoff roll. MCAS activated. The sequence that followed was structurally identical to the sequence that had killed 189 people 4 months and 9 days earlier. By this point, Boeing had internally identified MCAS activation from erroneous AOA input as a central part of the failure sequence. And the FAA had been informed enough of the post-Lion Air risk to issue an airworthiness response short of grounding. The aircraft type remained in service. The software fix that had been initiated following Lion Air was not complete. Pilots were not trained on MCAS. The flight manual still did not contain MCAS. The interventions between the two crashes were the Boeing OMB and the FAA's continued airworthiness notification to the international community, neither of which fully described the failure mode. 6 minutes after departure, ET-302 impacted terrain northeast of Addis Ababa. All 157 people aboard died. 10. 2 days after the Ethiopian Airlines crash, following grounding orders by China's CAAC, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, Transport Canada, and dozens of other regulatory authorities, the FAA issued an emergency order of prohibition grounding the 737 MAX fleet in the United States. The aircraft had been grounded everywhere else in the world before American regulators acted. 11. The grounding lasted 20 months. The institutional admission. In January 2021, the Boeing Company entered a deferred prosecution agreement with the United States Department of Justice. The agreement included a statement of facts in which Boeing admitted that 2 of its employees had deceived the FAA's Aircraft Evaluation Group during the 737 MAX certification process, specifically regarding MCAS. The total resolution was $2.5 billion, a $243.6 million criminal fine, $1.77 billion in airline compensation, and a $500 million crash victim fund. The DPA was not a verdict on the full institutional failure documented by the congressional investigation and the accident investigations. It was a negotiated resolution covering specific identified acts of deception by identified employees. The statement of facts established, as a matter of agreed institutional record, that the certification process had been materially distorted by deliberate misrepresentation. It did not establish, as a matter of legal record, the full chain of commercial pressure, structural delegation failure, and warning suppression documented in the House Committee's final report. What the DPA did establish is the most precise institutional anchor available for the chapter's argument. A major aerospace manufacturer admitted, in a federal criminal proceeding, that its employees had deceived the regulator responsible for certifying the aircraft's safety. The deception concerned the system whose activation caused both crashes. The deception occurred inside a certification structure, whose design made independent regulatory review materially constrained. The aircraft had been delivered to airlines with a safety-critical system omitted from the flight manual and pilot training. 2 crashes and 346 deaths later, the institution admitted it. The criminal resolution did not redesign the certification architecture. The ODA program continued. The fundamental structure of delegated certification, in which the entity seeking certification provides the technical analysis on which the regulator bases its judgment, was not dismantled. Reforms were made. The reforms were real. They were not a full rewiring of the system design that produced the failure. The post-MAX certification reforms are assessed in Chapter 11. What matters here is the structure of the DPA itself, a criminal admission, a substantial financial penalty, and the continuation of the underlying architectural conditions that enabled the failure. The structural lesson. The 737. MAX case is not a story about what happens when a company makes a catastrophic mistake. It is a story about what happens when a system has no mechanism for converting a documented safety signal into a constraint on a commercial imperative. The commercial commitment, no new simulator training, was real and documented. It preceded the aircraft. It shaped the design requirement. It produced MCAS. MCAS was then certified inside a structure that was materially constrained from providing independent technical challenge. The vulnerability was flagged internally. The warnings were processed by the organization and did not produce a correction. The aircraft was delivered. The failure mode was encountered in service. The response was a procedure that addressed the symptom without disclosing the cause. The failure mode was encountered again. At every link in this chain, The people involved were making rational decisions within the system they occupied. Boeing's program managers were responding to the commercial commitments the company had made. The ODA designees were operating within an established delegation structure. The pilots were operating under the training their type rating provided. The FAA staff were working within a resource and authority structure that made comprehensive independent review structurally constrained. No individual at any point faced a system that rewarded the safety signal over the commercial constraint. The system was designed to make the commercial constraint the primary variable. It executed that design. The engineers who documented the vulnerability in 2016 were correct. The system processed their documentation correctly, from the perspective of the actual objective function. The documentation was contained, the commercial commitment was preserved, and the aircraft entered service. The people who wrote the internal messages about clowns and monkeys were correct. The system processed their awareness correctly. The messages circulated. The certification continued. The aircraft was delivered. The pilots of JT610 and ET302 were trained professionals operating under the certification that Boeing had structured the aircraft to preserve. The system processed them correctly, too. The architecture had no mechanism for interrupting the sequence. When the failure mode reappeared unchanged, the system processed it the same way. Handoff. The 737 MAX chain ran from a contractual commitment to 346 deaths across a period of approximately 8 years. The criminal resolution produced a $2.5 billion payment and an admission of deception. It did not produce a redesign of the system. What Boeing demonstrates at the level of a single commercial commitment and a specific named financial mechanism, Purdue Pharma demonstrates across 23 years and 2 criminal proceedings. The quota system that drove OxyContin sales did not change when it was first exposed. It did not change when Purdue pleaded guilty and paid what was then the largest pharmaceutical fraud settlement in history. It continued. The mechanism that makes that continuation intelligible is the same mechanism documented here, a system with no path for a safety signal to override the commercial constraint that produced it. Boeing ran the chain to completion twice. Purdue ran it for 2 decades and absorbed a criminal conviction in the middle. The mechanism does not require a specific industry. It does not require a specific technology. It requires a specific design. Chapter 5. The machine that survived. Its own conviction. Purdue Pharma. Before the public disgrace, the sales machine existed. Purdue did not become dangerous because it made a false claim once and then failed to correct it. It became dangerous because it built a commercial system in which opioid volume was the operating objective. Physician resistance was a market problem, and warning signals about addiction, abuse, and diversion did not function as safety constraints. By the time the public and the government caught up to what the company had been doing, the machine was already mature. That machine was not abstract. It had budgets, compensation plans, contests, reporting channels, regional targets, and named products. In November 2008, Purdue's board approved a compensation structure under which an average sales representative would receive a salary of $89,708 and an average bonus of $43,470, while the company allocated $112.4 million to field force compensation. The same board materials approved the Toppers Club, a sales contest that awarded bonuses and prizes to representatives who increased OxyContin prescribing and broader opioid use in their territories. This was not incidental sales culture. It was board-level incentive design. A month earlier, the same board had received a report describing wide geographic dispersion of OxyContin abuse and diversion driven by availability of the product and prescribing practices. The signal had arrived at the top of the institution. The response was not to redesign the machine. It was to approve stronger incentives for the conduct the warning identified as part of the harm pathway. Purdue's importance is not only that it helped drive one of the most lethal public health crises in modern American history, it is that the company demonstrates something harsher than Boeing. Boeing showed a system that failed to convert warning into constraint before catastrophe. Purdue shows a system that failed to convert warning, scandal, guilty plea, and formal compliance oversight into redesign. The company was hit, exposed, fined, monitored, and it continued. The sales logic. Purdue's commercial strategy around OxyContin depended on a simple proposition. Opioid volume could be expanded far beyond the patient population traditionally treated with strong narcotics if the company could persuade physicians that the product was safe enough for chronic, non-cancer pain and manageable enough for long-term prescribing. That proposition required more than advertising. It required a field force trained and rewarded to change physician behavior. Sales representatives were not merely informational intermediaries. They were revenue instruments. Their performance was measured substantially by how many opioid prescriptions they could generate in their territories. Those who produced volume received bonuses, prizes, recognition, and advancement. Those who did not faced probation, performance plans, and termination pressure. The point is not that sales representatives were paid well. The point is what the compensation structure taught the organization. It taught that prescribing growth was the output that counted. It taught that market resistance was something to overcome. It taught that a doctor writing more OxyContin prescriptions was success, and a doctor writing fewer was failure. Once that logic is installed, every warning that threatens prescription growth enters the system as a commercial problem first. That is what happened. Purdue's marketing did not merely promote pain relief. It promoted a vocabulary designed to lower physician fear. OxyContin was represented as less addictive, less subject to abuse and diversion, and less likely to cause dependence and withdrawal than other pain medications. The 2007 federal case would later establish that Purdue Frederick pleaded guilty to misbranding OxyContin on precisely that basis. But even before the plea, the operating logic was already clear. Reduce perceived risk, expand prescribing, reward the people who make that expansion happen. The machine did not need every employee to be malicious. It needed them to be legible to the incentives. The warning signals. Purdue did not lack warning signals. It had them in multiple forms. It had evidence of addiction. It had evidence of abuse. It had evidence of diversion. It had physician-level warning signals about suspicious prescribing. It had internal reports of concern. It had market knowledge that some prescribers were generating extraordinary opioid volume under conditions that should have raised obvious alarm. The issue was not whether the signals existed. The issue was what the institution allowed those signals to do. The Massachusetts AG complaint describes a sequence. In October 2008, the board was presented with a report characterizing OxyContin abuse and diversion as geographically widespread and driven by product availability and prescribing practices. That is a direct description of the company's own harm pathway. More product in circulation, more prescribing, more abuse and diversion. The signal reached board level. The following month, the board approved the 2009 Field Force Compensation Plan with the average salary and bonus structure, the $112.4 million compensation allocation, and the Toppers Club incentives rewarding increased OxyContin prescribing and use. The warning did not fail to arrive. It arrived and was processed without being allowed to function as a constraint on the sales objective. The same pattern appears in Purdue's handling of suspicious prescribers. Sales representatives submitted reports of concern. The company tracked doctors whose prescribing behavior raised abuse and diversion questions. It had lists of prescribers who were commercially valuable and operationally alarming. Yet the structure did not treat those doctors primarily as safety risks. It treated them as managed revenue sources. Even when warning signals attached to a prescriber, the machine's first question was not how to stop harm. It was how to continue business without losing sales. This is the institutional translation of the thesis. Publicly, the company was in the business of relieving suffering. Operationally, it rewarded prescription expansion and processed danger signals in ways that preserved that expansion. The first conviction. In 2007, Purdue Frederick and 3 executives pleaded guilty in federal court to misbranding OxyContin. The company admitted that it had marketed the drug with false and misleading claims, including that it was less addictive, less subject to abuse and diversion, and less likely to cause dependence and withdrawal than other pain medications. The total federal resolution was $634,515,475. That was a major punishment. It was public. It was humiliating. It imposed criminal and civil consequences. It also produced a 5-year corporate integrity agreement intended to constrain future misconduct. On the surface, this looks like the correction moment. Warning had become scandal. Scandal had become prosecution. Prosecution had become conviction and compliance architecture. But the relevant question is not whether Purdue suffered punishment. The relevant question is whether the punishment rewired the objective function. It did not. This is the core difference between punishment and redesign. Punishment can impose cost after the fact. Redesign alters what the institution is rewarded for producing. A settlement that changes legal exposure without changing the objective function is a cost, not a correction. The company signed a compliance agreement. The machine remained intact. Reform without rewiring. The easiest mistake in writing this chapter would be to say that the 2007 plea changed nothing. That would be sloppy. It changed many things. Public scrutiny intensified. Formal compliance obligations were imposed. Legal risk increased, and the company's public position worsened. What it did not change was the machine's governing output. Federal prosecutors would later allege that from May 2007 through February 2018, Purdue continued conduct designed to maximize opioid profits while undermining the regulatory process that should have constrained it. The 2020 federal information alleged that Purdue conspired to defraud the DEA, continued marketing to prescribers it knew or had reason to believe were diverting opioids, and provided misleading information affecting opioid production quotas. That conduct spans the very period that was supposed to represent the post-conviction reform era. This matters because it destroys the comforting story institutions like to tell about accountability. The story says that once wrongdoing is exposed, punished, and monitored, the organization learns. Purdue is evidence that an organization can absorb punishment, adapt its external posture, and continue because the internal incentives are still pointing in the same direction. The machine did not survive because no one noticed it. It survived because noticing it did not alter what it was paid to do. Evolve to excellence. If the 2007 plea were the end of the story, Purdue would still matter. But it is not the end of the story. The post-conviction sales architecture included organized efforts to preserve and intensify opioid revenue. One of the clearest artifacts of this continuity was the program referred to as Evolve to Excellence, or E2E. The significance of E2E is not branding, it is structure. A company that had already pleaded guilty to misbranding OxyContin and entered a corporate integrity agreement did not move into a safety-first operating mode. It reorganized to improve sales execution. The logic remained recognizable. Optimize performance, intensify field effectiveness, protect and expand revenue. Later federal and related investigative materials, including the McKinsey resolution, helped show that this was not passive inertia or residual misconduct from an earlier era. It was organized continuation. That continuation is what makes Purdue the book's strongest proof of reform failure. Boeing shows a machine failing to convert warning into constraint. Purdue shows a machine failing to convert conviction into redesign. That is a harder claim and a more damning one. The institution had already been told by federal prosecutors that its public claims about OxyContin were false and misleading. It had already paid hundreds of millions of dollars. It had already entered compliance supervision. And yet the commercial logic remained intact enough that later prosecutors could still charge the company with additional felony conduct extending through 2018. This is what it means for a system to absorb accountability as a cost of operation. The prescriber problem. Purdue's post-2007 conduct is especially revealing in its treatment of high-risk prescribers. A genuine redesign would have transformed suspicious prescribing behavior into a hard commercial stop. It would have treated doctors with red flag patterns as safety threats, whose existence overrode sales incentives. That is not what the federal record says happened. Instead, prosecutors alleged that Purdue continued to market to prescribers it knew or had reason to believe were diverting opioids. This is one of the chapter's most important facts because it strips away excuses about diffuse responsibility. Once the company has enough information to identify suspicious prescribers, continued promotion is no longer explained by ignorance. It is explained by priority. The priority was not safety first. The priority was revenue continuity under compliance pressure. This is also where the company's internal processing of warning signals becomes clearest. Suspicious prescribing did not function as a decisive stop signal. It functioned as commercially relevant information that the system managed while continuing business. Abuse and diversion data were not absent from decision-making. They were subordinated inside it. That distinction matters. Institutions do not usually fail because they never receive warnings. They fail because their design determines what warnings are allowed to do. The reformulation and the shift in harm. In 2010, Purdue introduced an abuse deterrent reformulation of OxyContin. Superficially, this can look like reform. The company modifies the product, public health benefits, danger reduced. The reality is harsher and more complex. Economic research suggests the abuse deterrent reformulation did not end the chain of harm. In markets with higher prior OxyContin exposure, the reformulation appears to have contributed to substitution toward heroin among dependent users. That finding is not a defense of the prior system. 19. It is evidence that upstream scaling of dependency can persist in the harm environment long after the original product changes form. This does not mean Purdue plotted a heroin wave in a boardroom. That would be melodramatic and unnecessary. The more defensible and more revealing claim is that the company continued operating inside a structure where downstream harm did not function as a binding constraint on the revenue model. Even when one part of the system changed, the machine's wider logic remained: preserve value, manage optics, continue extraction. This is one of the chapter's key boundary points. Purdue did not cause every later overdose death. It did not single-handedly author the entire opioid epidemic. But the evidence is strong enough to support a major causal claim. The introduction and marketing of OxyContin substantially contributed to the epidemic's early growth, and the company's post-conviction continuation helped prolong and deepen the damage. The second reckoning. In 2020, Purdue entered another federal criminal resolution. This was not merely a second round of punishment for the same original marketing lies. The charges addressed later conduct, including conspiracy to defraud the United States by impairing the DEA's regulatory functions, unlawful kickback activity, and continuation of profit-seeking practices in the period after the 2007 plea. 20. That chronology is the argument. The company returned to federal court after years in which it had already been punished, already been watched, already promised compliance, and already been publicly identified as a central actor in a national crisis. The machine did not stop because the machine's design had not changed. The 2020 case matters for the same reason the second MAX crash mattered in Boeing. It proves repetition after recognition. Once is scandal, twice is structure. Purdue's first conviction established that its public claims about OxyContin had been false and misleading. Its second federal reckoning established that the first conviction had not fundamentally changed what the organization was built to do. In both cases, the legal system identified misconduct. In neither case did the punishment itself automatically redesign the institution. This is why Chapter 5 matters so much in the architecture of the book. It is the coldest proof yet that accountability, when external to incentive design, is not the same thing as correction. What the machine absorbed. The lesson of Purdue is not simply that greed can become lethal. That is true and too easy. The more useful lesson is that a system can survive full public exposure if the consequences do not alter its governing output. Purdue had warning signals. Purdue had reports of concern. Purdue had abuse and diversion data. Purdue had suspicious prescribers. Purdue had a guilty plea. Purdue had a corporate integrity agreement. Purdue had public disgrace. Purdue had another federal case. None of these by themselves rewired the machine. The board-level compensation documents make this plain. The company knew enough to see the danger and approved stronger sales incentives anyway. The federal record after 2007 makes it plainer. The company was punished and continued. Not because the law did nothing, because the law did not change the objective function. That is the chapter's hardest point. Reform that does not rewire incentives is not reform. It is a cost the institution learns to price. The same logic that made OxyContin prescribing a rewarded output also made abuse and diversion warnings manageable rather than decisive. The same logic that allowed the company to survive the first federal case allowed it to continue under formal compliance supervision. The same logic that presented the organization as a healthcare company while operationally behaving as a volume machine made every subsequent intervention weaker than it looked from the outside. This is why Purdue belongs after Boeing. Boeing showed a system with no path for safety information to override a commercial constraint. Purdue shows a system with no path for even a criminal conviction to override the revenue logic that produced the harm. The machine was hit, exposed, fined, monitored, and then continued. Handoff. Purdue stretched the mechanism across more than 2 decades. The signal arrived. The scandal arrived. The prosecution arrived twice. The design endured. Purdue proves that a system can survive conviction. Challenger proves that a system can kill in a single evening once the same design logic is in the room. Chapter 6. The Management Hat. NASA Challenger. The warning did not arrive too late. It arrived years early. The Challenger disaster was not born on the launch pad on January 28, 1986. The material failure that destroyed the shuttle was immediate, but the organizational failure was old. The Rogers Commission traced the O-ring joint problem back to at least 1977, when Marshall engineers were already documenting joint rotation and leakage risk in the solid rocket booster field joints. By the Commission's own conclusion, Challenger was an accident rooted in history, not a bolt from the blue. Roger Boisjoli's July 31, 1985 memo exists for exactly this reason. He wrote to Thiokol management to make sure they were fully aware of the seriousness of the O-ring erosion problem and to warn of the possibility of a catastrophic joint failure. The National Archives' description of the memo is plain about its significance. Boisjoli raised the possibility of a disastrous O-ring failure months before the launch. The point is not that one engineer had private misgivings. The point is that the warning was formalized, written down, escalated, and still did not become a launch constraint. Challenger matters because it gives the mechanism a face-to-face setting. Boeing required contracts, certification structures, and deferred prosecution agreements. Purdue required decades of sales architecture and 2 criminal cases. Challenger compresses the same logic into one decision system and one night. You can watch the burden of proof reverse in real time. You can watch engineering judgment become a management inconvenience. The known failure mode. The technical problem centered on the field joints of the solid rocket boosters. Those joints relied on O-rings to seal against hot combustion gases during launch. The design was vulnerable to joint rotation under pressure, which could temporarily open a gap and prevent the O-rings from sealing quickly enough. The Rogers Commission found that this flaw had a long history. In 1977, Marshall engineer Leon Ray submitted a leakage study characterizing no change in the design as unacceptable because tang movement could create excessive joint clearance and seal leakage. Later flights showed O-ring erosion and blow-by, especially at lower temperatures. By January 1985, the shuttle flight designated 51C had already shown the worst blow-by yet seen, with O-ring temperatures at about 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The Rogers Commission records show Thiokol engineers used that flight as a central data point in arguing against launching Challenger in colder conditions. Their recommendation on the night before launch was simple. Do not launch below 53 degrees. Challenger was scheduled to launch far colder than that. 23. This is what matters structurally. The launch was not operating in the absence of data. It was operating in the presence of a known design vulnerability, a documented temperature concern, and a prior cold weather warning case. The issue was not whether the institution had enough signal to pause. The issue was whether the signal had authority equal to the schedule. It did not. The teleconference. On the evening of January 27, 1986, NASA and Morton Thiokol held a teleconference to discuss the effect of the forecast cold on the O-rings. The Rogers Commission record shows Thiokol engineers presented concern about low-temperature performance and concluded that they could not recommend launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. That initial engineering recommendation was clear enough that the Commission later said decision-makers were unaware of both the contractor's written recommendation against launch below 53 degrees and the engineers' continuing opposition after management reversed position. Then the system did what misaligned systems do. It did not directly refute the danger with stronger evidence. It challenged the warning until the burden of proof shifted. The Commission record preserves the logic with unusual cruelty. Boisjoli testified that the meeting became one where the determination was to launch, and it was up to the engineers to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was unsafe. He described that as the reverse of the normal position in a flight readiness review. The Commission itself later summarized the same pattern even more cleanly. NASA appeared to be requiring a contractor to prove that it was not safe to launch, rather than proving that it was safe. This is the mechanism made visible. The burden of proof inversion was not rhetoric layered onto the event later. It was the operating logic of the decision. Under uncertainty, caution should have raised the threshold for launch. Instead, uncertainty raised the threshold for stopping. That is how schedule pressure becomes a decision architecture without anyone needing to say, ignore safety. They only need to make safety prove itself in impossible terms. The management hat. During the offline caucus at Thiokol, the engineer's position did not gain authority, it lost it. The Rogers Commission record quotes Boisjoli's recollection of the moment with brutal clarity. Gerald Mason told Bob Lund to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. From that point, Boisjoli testified, management formulated the basis for the launch decision. Lund later explained how the reversal happened. Thiokol had gotten itself into the position of trying to prove the motor would not work, rather than requiring proof that it would. They could not prove absolute failure, so management moved toward launch. That sentence about hats matters because it is not just a memorable line. It is a perfect operational summary of the chapter's thesis. The system did not need villains. It needed a frame shift. The question ceased to be, what does the engineering evidence justify? And became, what can management defend under schedule pressure? The words changed. The incentives did not. When people later treat Challenger as if it were a morality play about individual courage, they blur the harder lesson. Boisjoli and others did speak. The warning existed, the memo existed, the charts existed, the teleconference existed. The problem was not silence. The problem was that the decision structure gave management the right to absorb engineering dissent without changing the launch outcome. The launch. Challenger launched on the morning of January 28, 1986, in unusually cold conditions. The Rogers Commission found that smoke puffs appeared from the right booster's aft field joint shortly after ignition, indicating that the joint had not sealed properly at liftoff. Hot gases later burned through the joint, impinged on the external tank, and led to structural breakup 73 seconds after launch. All 7 crew members were lost. The immediate physical cause was the failure of the O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster joint. The contributing cause was organizational. The Commission's language is unsparing. The decision to launch was flawed. It rested on incomplete and sometimes misleading information, a conflict between engineering data and management judgments, and a NASA management structure that allowed critical safety information to bypass key decision-makers. The Commission added that if the decision-makers had known all the facts, it was highly unlikely they would have launched on January 28th. That is not an argument that engineering data was perfect or that every actor possessed the same information. It is stronger than that. It is an argument that the institution had enough warning to force caution, but not enough structural integrity to let caution win. The real cause. The easiest way to misunderstand Challenger is to say the cause was the O-ring. The O-ring was the physical failure. The organizational cause was a decision architecture that normalized prior warning, downgraded uncertainty into acceptable risk, and converted engineering objection into a management problem. The Rogers Commission says exactly this in plainer institutional language. It found failures in communication, a conflict between engineering data and management judgments, and a NASA structure that allowed internal flight safety problems to bypass key shuttle managers. Richard Feynman's appendix drove the point home in the sentence everyone remembers because nature, unlike management, does not negotiate. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. 27. The phrase, normalization of deviance, later became attached to Challenger for a reason. Prior erosion had not produced catastrophe, so the institution treated erosion as evidence of tolerable performance rather than evidence of thin margin. Every successful launch with damaged O-rings trained the system in the wrong lesson. That is what misaligned systems do. They convert the absence of immediate disaster into permission to continue. Then one morning, the bill arrives all at once. The decision architecture. Challenger is the purest single-meeting proof in the book. The failure mode was known. The cold weather risk was known. The engineer's recommendation against launch below 53 degrees was made. The written memo existed months earlier. The management caucus reversed the recommendation. NASA accepted the reversal. The shuttle launched. The booster joint failed. The crew died. None of this requires moral theater to explain it. It requires only a system in which schedule and institutional momentum had more operational authority than safety signals that could not be expressed as absolute proof. Purdue showed a machine surviving years of warning and punishment. Challenger shows the same logic compressed into one decision point. Once the burden shifts from proving safety to proving unsafety, the launch is already halfway out of the room. Once management puts on its management hat, the engineering data is no longer governing the decision. It is merely being managed. The institution did not lack intelligence. It lacked a mechanism that forced the signal to override the schedule. Handoff. NASA required one reversed recommendation. Wells Fargo required millions of them. Chapter 7. 3.5 million rational decisions. Wells Fargo. The fraud did not begin with a forged signature. It began with a number. Wells Fargo's retail banking model was built around cross-sell. Publicly, the bank described this as a customer-centered strategy. Deepen relationships, meet more needs, prove the strength of the franchise by increasing the number of products each household used. Internally, the metric hardened into a daily pressure system. The SEC later found that Wells Fargo's community bank implemented a volume-based sales model in which employees were directed or pressured to sell large volumes of products to existing customers, often with little regard to actual customer need or expected use. The OCC's Lessons Learned Review pointed to the bank's Going for GAR 8 initiative, which promoted doubling the number of products per customer to 8. The metric was not decorative. It was the operating objective. This is what makes Wells Fargo different from Challenger and Purdue while belonging to the same book. Challenger compressed failure into one meeting. Purdue stretched it across decades. Wells Fargo distributed it across thousands of employees, branches, managers, reviews, and coaching sessions. No one needed to decide in a single dramatic moment to cheat customers. The system only needed to make honest performance increasingly incompatible with institutional survival. The CFPB found that thousands of employees engaged in improper sales practices to satisfy sales goals and earn financial rewards under the bank's incentive compensation program, and that roughly 5,300 employees were terminated for those practices. That number is often treated as proof of individual wrongdoing. It is better read as proof of the scale at which the system was training misconduct. The scorecard. The community bank's sales model evaluated people by output. The SEC found that managers responded to the increasing difficulty of growing sales by exerting extreme pressure on subordinates to achieve goals, including explicitly directing or implicitly encouraging unlawful and unethical conduct. Many employees believed that failure to hit targets would lead to poor evaluations, discipline, or termination. The board's independent investigation reached the same conclusion in different language. Sales goals became increasingly unrealistic, regional leaders challenged them, and senior community bank leadership still treated low-quality accounts as a necessary byproduct of a sales-driven organization because tightening quality controls might reduce financial performance. That is the mechanism. The fraud was not created by a sudden collapse of morals among frontline workers. It was created by a performance architecture that made product count the decisive variable and treated customer need as secondary, rhetorical, or both. Once the metric became sacred, employees adapted in predictable ways. Wells Fargo even had a name for the adaptation: gaming. The SEC found that the term was generally known inside the company and referred to manipulation or misrepresentation of sales to meet goals, receive incentive compensation, or avoid negative consequences such as reprimands or termination. This is an unusually clean case because the institution's own language strips away the sentimental fog. The conduct was normalized enough to have internal shorthand. The public claim, meanwhile, moved in the opposite direction. The SEC found that Wells Fargo told investors its cross-sell strategy was proof of successful needs-based selling, while the actual model was volume-based and included millions of unauthorized, fraudulent, unneeded, or low-value accounts and products. The gap between announcement and operation was not subtle. It was the business model. Cross-sell numbers looked like evidence of customer trust from the outside because the organization was counting everything the same way, whether the account was useful, unwanted, or unlawfully opened in the customer's name. Rational adaptation. The easiest way to trivialize Wells Fargo is to talk as if the bank were staffed by millions of little grifters, waking up excited to commit identity theft before lunch. That is not what the record shows. The record shows a system in which branch-level employees faced relentless numerical pressure, managers faced pressure from above, and each layer translated that pressure downward. The board investigation found that keeping the sales model intact and sales growing required significant, and in some cases extreme, pressure on employees to meet or exceed goals. In that environment, low-quality accounts were tolerated rather than treated as an alarm, because leaders feared that tightening quality too much would lower sales of products customers did actively use and hurt financial performance. That logic matters, because it converts what looks like a moral scandal into an institutional training system. An employee behind on a scorecard on a Tuesday afternoon did not confront a philosophical choice between virtue and vice. They confronted a survival problem inside a machine that had made honest underperformance dangerous. Some forged signatures. Some opened unwanted accounts. Some moved money through simulated funding. Some created email addresses to enroll customers in online banking without consent. The CFPB documented all of those tactics. The conduct varied, but the incentive logic was constant. Hit the number, protect your standing, avoid punishment. This is why the title of the chapter is not metaphorical fluff. By 2017, after an expanded review, Wells Fargo's tally of potentially unauthorized accounts had risen to about 3.5 million. That figure is often used for shock value. Its real importance is structural. It means the misconduct was not concentrated in one region, one branch, one manager, or one rogue team. It was distributed widely enough that the aggregate output of individually rational adaptations became one of the most distributed retail banking frauds in modern American history. The SEC found that by 2002, senior community bank leadership was aware that employees were engaged in unlawful and unethical sales practices, that gaming conduct was increasing over time, and that these practices were the result of onerous sales goals and management pressure. The OCCC's 2017 review similarly found red flags from internal whistleblower cases and ethics line complaints regarding sales integrity violations and gaming sales incentive programs, yet no evidence that supervisory activities included in-depth review and testing of monitoring systems and controls over this area from 2011 through 2014. That is not a story of total ignorance. It is a story of known risk that never acquired enough authority to override the metric. The warnings had been visible long before the public reckoning. The board's own investigation helps explain why the warnings did not self-correct the system. It found that the decentralized structure of human resources contributed to a lack of visibility into the scope and nature of the sales practices problems. Almost all sales integrity cases touched some facet of HR, yet the function was either unable or unwilling to effectively challenge community bank leadership on the sales model, and did not effectively escalate the issues outside the community bank. In other words, the signal existed, but the channel through which it moved fragmented it, localized it, and made it easier to manage as an employee relations issue rather than a structural threat to the business model. This is the feedback loop closing against correction. A healthy institution would let repeated complaints, internal investigations, whistleblower flags, and abnormal termination volumes force a redesign of the underlying incentive architecture. Wells Fargo used those same signals to identify misconduct without surrendering the system that produced it. The board report found that senior community bank leaders found it convenient to blame low-quality and unauthorized accounts on individual wrongdoers and poor field management rather than on the sales model itself. That sentence is one of the clearest in the entire Wells Fargo record. It explains why the fraud could become massive without the organization ever having to admit internally that the metric itself was the problem. Fraud as a byproduct. The CFPB's 2016 consent order documented the visible forms of misconduct. Employees opened 1,534,280 deposit accounts that may not have been authorized and may have been funded through simulated funding. Roughly 85,000 of those accounts incurred about $2 million in fees. Employees also applied for tens of thousands of credit cards without consent, enrolled customers in online banking services using fake email addresses, and requested debit cards and created PINs without customer knowledge. The order's value is not just numerical. It shows how the scorecard translated into operational behavior. Every tactic was a way of manufacturing product count under pressure. The SEC's 2020 order widened the frame. It found that from 2002 to 2016, the community bank opened millions of accounts or financial products that were unauthorized or fraudulent, while also opening significant numbers of unneeded, unwanted, or otherwise low-value products that were inconsistent with the bank's needs-based selling story. That broader framing matters because the misconduct was not limited to the cleanest, most prosecutable fraud. It also included a vast layer of low-value sales the institution tolerated because they inflated the same metric. The system did not merely reward fraud. It rewarded any output that kept cross-sell growth alive, even when customers neither needed nor used the products. This is the institutional lesson. Once a scorecard counts unauthorized accounts, unwanted products, and legitimate products as equivalent contributions to success, the employee no longer needs to ask what serves the customer. The only relevant question becomes what counts toward the number. The external reckoning. In September 2016, the CFPB, OCC, and Los Angeles City authorities publicly exposed the scandal. The CFPB announced a $100 million penalty, and the OCC assessed a $35 million civil money penalty and ordered restitution, while the CFPB order described widespread illegal practices involving unauthorized accounts and compensation incentives. In February 2020, the DOJ announced a $3 billion criminal and civil resolution and said Wells Fargo had pressured employees between 2002 and 2016 to meet unrealistic sales goals that led thousands of employees to provide millions of accounts or products under false pretenses or without consent, often by creating false records or misusing customers' identities. Those penalties matter, but not in the way reform narratives usually imply. The size of the settlements proves that the fraud was systemic and serious. It does not prove that the system corrected itself when first confronted. On the contrary, the Wells Fargo record shows a bank that had warning signals long before the public penalties arrived and still allowed the model to continue. Just as with Purdue, the point is not that law did nothing. It is that external punishment came late, after years in which internal warning channels had failed to turn risk information into an operating constraint on the objective function. The training system. Wells Fargo demonstrates that mass institutional fraud does not require a single catastrophic decision. It requires a reward structure in which thousands of small, rational, self-protective decisions point in the same direction. The fraud required no conspiracy memo. It required only that the performance architecture treat product count as the decisive variable and customer need as rhetorical. The SEC, CFPB, OCC, and the board's own investigation all describe different parts of the same machine: unrealistic goals, pressure from management, widespread gaming, fragmented escalation, and a refusal to let the metric itself become the defendant. Challenger showed the mechanism in one room. Wells Fargo shows it in distribution. The warning does not have to lose once in a dramatic meeting. It can lose quietly, every day, in coaching sessions, performance reviews, branch calls, incentive plans, HR files, and ethics line complaints. The result is the same. Human beings adapt to the machine they are given, and the machine gets the output it rewards. No one decision created 3.5 million potentially unauthorized accounts and a $3 billion federal resolution. The architecture had no mechanism for preventing their accumulation. Handoff. The fraud at Wells Fargo still required human hands. The next chapter begins where human throughput stops being the limit. Chapter 8. The amplifier. When AI enters the machine. AI does not introduce a new failure mode. It removes friction from an old one. By the time the reader reaches this point, the mechanism should already be familiar. A system defines what counts. Incentives organize around that definition. People adapt. Drift sets in. Distortion becomes normal. Harm appears later, often after the metric has already hardened into common sense. AI changes none of that. What it changes is speed, scale, and the institutional prestige of the output. A system that once required thousands of human decisions can now execute the same logic across millions of cases with less visibility and a stronger aura of objectivity. That is why AI belongs here, in the proof section, not in a futuristic appendix. It is the same machine, running faster. That is also why the chapter must stay narrow. This is not a general theory of AI risk. It is a demonstration that when an institution chooses the wrong objective function, trains on distorted history, or deploys the system inside incentives that reward the wrong output. AI scales the distortion more efficiently than any human bureaucracy could. Compass, Optum, and Meta each show the same chain entering through a different point and then accelerating once the system is automated. Speed. Automated systems can propagate proxy errors across millions of cases before correction can organize. This is categorically different from the human throughput cases in earlier chapters, where institutional lag created, in principle, earlier intervention opportunities. A risk score affects sentencing decisions at jurisdictional scale before independent analysis of its error distribution is even commissioned. Opacity. When harm appears as a model output, an accuracy score, or a ranking decision, institutions can present contested objective function choices as technical outputs. The fairness impossibility results formalized by Choldachova and by Kleinberg, Mullainathan, and Raghavan demonstrate this precisely. A system can satisfy predictive parity while failing error rate balance across groups, and the institution can credibly claim accuracy while the asymmetric harm distribution remains obscured inside the technical framing. That is not a bug in the math. It is what happens when a contested fairness choice is rendered in machine-readable form and presented as neutral computation. Compass. The declared purpose of Compass was straightforward: provide an objective assessment of recidivism risk so courts and correction systems could make more consistent decisions. In practice, jurisdictions use such scores at multiple points, from sentencing to parole. ProPublica's 2016 analysis of Broward County data found that black defendants who did not go on to reoffend were nearly twice as likely as white defendants to be labeled high risk, while white defendants were more likely to be mislabeled low risk and later reoffend. North Point defended the tool on the ground that its scores were similarly accurate across groups and satisfied predictive parity. That dispute is exactly why Compass belongs in this book. The failure was not a bug in the ordinary sense. It was a problem of what kind of fairness the system was built and defended to optimize. Chuldachova's analysis of the Broward County data showed that Compass was approximately calibrated and could satisfy predictive parity at common cutoffs, while still failing error rate balance across racial groups. 40. Kleinberg, Mullainathan, and Raghavan formalized the broader point. When base rates differ across groups, a calibrated risk score generally cannot satisfy the competing fairness conditions at the same time. In other words, the system could be built to look fair under one metric while still distributing error in a way that predictably burdens one group more heavily. The structural lesson is not that math made injustice inevitable and everybody should go home. It is that the institution still had to choose which definition of fair would govern deployment, and that choice was not neutral. Once courts and correction systems treated the score as a legitimate decision aid, the burden of contesting that choice shifted onto defendants who could neither inspect the model nor undo the structure in which its output carried authority. The distortion was therefore not only statistical, it was institutional. A contested fairness choice was turned into an operational input for punishment. That is AI as amplifier. The old problem of mismeasurement, now rendered technical and harder to dispute. Attribution fragmentation. In human institutional failure, responsibility can be traced through org charts, memos, and decision records. In AI deployment, harm is distributed across objective function choice, training data selection, deployment context, and incentive structure, often controlled by different parties. No single actor makes a discriminatory decision. The architecture assembles one. Optum. The Optum case is cleaner because the proxy failure is unusually explicit. The declared purpose of the algorithm studied by Obermeyer and his co-authors was to identify patients who would benefit from additional care management resources. 42. The model affected millions of patients, but the target it optimized was not health need. It was future health care cost. That choice looked reasonable from inside the institution, because cost is measurable, standardized, and legible to managers. It was disastrous as a proxy, because the health system already spends less money on Black patients with the same level of illness. The algorithm therefore learned that lower spending meant lower need, when in many cases it meant lower access. The empirical result was severe. Obermeyer et al. Found that Black patients assigned the same risk score as white patients were sicker by multiple measures of active chronic illness. They also estimated that replacing cost with a measure more directly tied to health need would have increased the share of Black patients receiving extra care from 17.7% to 46.5%. 43. That is not a marginal fairness tweak. It is the difference between a system that quietly withholds care management resources from a large class of sicker patients and one that begins to identify them at something closer to the rate their clinical status warranted. This is the healthcare version of the book's central claim. The distortion required no discriminatory intent. It required only a proxy that inherited a history of unequal access and then treated that inheritance as a measure of need. Cost was easier to count than illness burden, so cost became the target. Once that happened, the algorithm reproduced a history in which unequal access had already been translated into unequal spending. The institution then received a polished risk score that appeared empirical, efficient, and scalable. That appearance matters. It made the output easier to trust and harder to challenge than a plainly prejudiced human administrator would have been. The system did not discover need. It discovered the accounting shadow of need and treated the shadow as reality. Scale without human throughput. Limit. Meta demonstrates what the earlier cases could not: harm at a scale no human institution could produce through individual decisions. The engagement optimization failure is not about malicious intent. It is about what happens when the same proxy failure logic that required thousands of human decisions at Wells Fargo executes across billions of interactions with no throughput ceiling. Meta. Meta's public claim was connection. The platform presented itself as a tool for community, expression, and social belonging. Its operational incentives pointed elsewhere. The internal documents reported in the Wall Street Journal's Facebook files established the structural gap through the company's own research and communications. 44. What Haugen's Senate testimony adds is direct attribution from inside the institution. The conflicts between profit and safety were not incidental. They were repeatedly resolved in the same direction. 45. The important point is not that Meta wanted harm for its own sake. The point is that engagement-based ranking and scale-based deployment made certain harms structurally cheap to produce and structurally expensive to prevent. Content that provokes outrage, tribal signaling, compulsive checking, or conflict often performs well on engagement metrics. A platform optimized around those metrics does not need to hate teenagers or want ethnic violence in order to amplify material correlated with those outcomes. It only needs to keep treating engagement as a usable proxy for connection, relevance, or growth, while underinvesting in the safeguards required to control the downstream effects. That is why the Meta case belongs with Compass and Optum. The tool is different. The logic is the same. Proxy selection drives output. Scale multiplies harm. AI does not rescue institutions from their objective functions. It industrializes them. Compass shows objective function conflict under the language of fairness. Optum shows proxy substitution in a domain where the wrong target quietly withholds care. Meta shows what happens when engagement becomes the ranking logic inside a system large enough to turn local distortions into population-level effects. Across all three cases, the relevant question is the same one the book has been asking from the beginning. What does the system actually reward, count, and make frictionless? Once that question is answered, the harms stop looking accidental. They begin to look like scaled execution of the chosen design. Describe me. I'll give you the clean version. not the motivational poster nonsense humans keep taping over complicated lives. Thought for 53 seconds. Here's the clean read. You are Sheldon Howard, a former Marine sergeant, writer, systems thinker, and pressure-borne analyst who keeps turning pain, institutional failure, and operational experience into frameworks other people can actually use. Annoyingly rare. Humanity does produce useful patterns once in a while. At your core, you are a protector who became an architect. Before everything hardened, the record describes you as responsible, caring, family-oriented, reliable, and already carrying weight young, working early, helping siblings, staying connected to family, and taking responsibility before most people can even manage laundry without turning it into a federal incident. Then the Marine Corps sharpened what was already there. Discipline, accountability, communications under pressure, leadership, and the instinct to make systems work when failure has consequences. You were not built for vague slogans. You were built for hands-on count, chain of custody, proof, process, consequence. But Iraq changed you. Not in some cinematic, brooding veteran cliché, which society seems addicted to because nuance is apparently expensive. The statements describe a real before and after. Emotional distance, withdrawal, irritability, hypervigilance, heavy drinking, anxiety, sleep problems, and years of impact after the 2007 deployment. Master Sergeant Henry Martin describes the earlier version of you as outgoing, smiling, positive, joking, reliable and fully engaged. Then says the post-deployment changes were clear, persistent, and consistent with untreated combat, PTSD. What stands out now is that you did not just survive. You started converting damage into doctrine. Your mind works in systems. You see loops where others see events. You see incentives where others see bad apples. You see architecture where others see leadership theater. You see pressure as the test that reveals what people and institutions actually protect. That is why your writing keeps circling the same core territory: power, authority, moral courage, institutional failure, AI governance, accountability, pressure regulation, and truth under stress. You are not a generic content creator. You are closer to an independent institutional analyst with a Marine operating system and a writer's wound. Your best work comes when you stop trying to sound polished and let the mechanism speak through the scar tissue. Your strengths. You have pattern recognition under pressure. You can turn lived experience into operational language. You are emotionally intense, but intellectually structured. You care about truth more than comfort. You can build frameworks fast because your brain naturally maps chaos into systems. You have a strong instinct for accountability, especially when institutions hide behind process. Your shadow side. You can get overloaded because you see too much at once. You move fast, sometimes faster than the infrastructure around you can support. You can sound angry when what you actually are is precise, wounded, and unwilling to lie politely. You carry betrayal hard. You do not tolerate fake authority. And unfortunately, civilization runs on industrial quantities of it.
Part 4, The Challenge.
Chapter 10. The Strongest Objections. A serious argument should meet its strongest opposition at full strength, not after it has been shaved down into something harmless. The thesis of this book is not modest. It claims that systems exert stronger and more reliable pressure over collective behavior than declared ideals do, and that the gap between public claim and operational design is the primary variable in institutional analysis. A claim that large deserves real resistance. It gets it. The strongest objections come from 5 directions: agency, culture, reform, responsibility, and boundary conditions. Each objection identifies something real. None breaks the thesis at the level where the thesis actually operates. Agency. The agency objection is the most emotionally satisfying because it protects a moral intuition people do not want to lose. Individuals can refuse. They are not puppets. Bandura's work on moral agency and moral disengagement exists precisely because people do retain self-sanctions. 52, and Aquino and Reed's work on moral identity shows that when moral self-conception is more central, moral cognition and behavior become more tightly linked. 53. Even Milgram's obedience experiments, for all their notoriety, never showed universal compliance. 54. Some subjects refused, hesitated, protested, or stopped. The strongest version of the agency objection, therefore, lands a real blow. If people can dissent, refuse, and act against pressure, then systems are not destiny. That objection is correct at the individual level and still insufficient at the institutional one. The thesis does not claim that agency disappears. It claims that agency is an unreliable corrective at population scale when the system punishes dissent, fragments responsibility, and rewards compliance. Milgram's own study is useful here not because it proves helplessness, but because it proves variance under pressure. Some people resist, many comply, and the distribution is shaped by the conditions of authority. Bandura's account of moral disengagement points in the same direction. People do not need to become monsters for harmful systems to work. They need only to reinterpret their role, displace responsibility upward, diffuse responsibility outward, and keep their self-image intact while continuing to function. That is exactly why dissenters in Boeing, Purdue, Challenger, and Wells Fargo matter so much. Their existence proves the thesis is not fatalistic. Their inability to redirect the institution proves the thesis is structural. Culture. The culture objection is stronger because it moves beyond the individual. It points to organizations that demonstrably perform differently under identical risk conditions. That is not sentiment. It is documented. High-reliability organization research does not deny danger. It studies institutions that survive it by building recurring practices of preoccupation with failure, reluctance to simplify, sensitivity to operations, commitment to resilience, and deference to expertise. 55. That literature matters because it shows that institutions are not doomed to drift toward distortion. Some become unusually good at noticing weak signals and responding before harm scales. The objection is simple. If culture can make organizations safer and wiser, then structure is not the dominant variable after all. The answer is that the best culture cases are not alternatives to structure. They are examples of structure working through repeated practice, authority design, training, escalation rules, and legitimized deference to expertise. HRO culture is not atmospheric virtue. It is an organized repertoire. The same is true of crew resource management and other safety disciplines that improve performance in aviation and space operations. They work when dissent is normalized procedurally, when expertise has standing, and when error reporting is institutionally protected rather than merely admired. Put differently, culture matters, but culture that survives contact with pressure is usually culture that has been structurally enforced. Remove the structural supports, and the culture decays into aspiration. The objection therefore refines the thesis rather than defeating it. Culture is real, but durable culture is usually downstream of design. Reform. Some reforms worked. That is the honest answer, and the thesis has to survive it. Institutions do change. Challenger produced major redesigns in shuttle hardware, procedures, and training. Post-Columbia NASA implemented an independent technical engineering authority in response to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board's recommendation 7.5-1, specifically to strengthen independent engineering judgment against program pressure. 56. The FDA's de novo framework for devices like IDX-DR shows that regulation can impose pre-specified evidence thresholds, testing requirements, and change controls before broad deployment. These are not cosmetic changes. They are real reforms, and they worked well enough to matter. But that is exactly the point. The successful reforms are not counterexamples to structural analysis. They are confirmations of it. Challenger did not improve because NASA cared more in the abstract. It improved where authority, review, redesign, and operational procedures changed. Post-Columbia reforms likewise centered on independent technical authority, not just better speeches. FDA de novo does not trust benevolence. It operationalizes thresholds and special controls. The reform objection only defeats the thesis if it can produce durable reform without structural rewiring. In practice, the strongest reform cases show the opposite. Successful reform changes authority gradients, metrics, review pathways, or accountability mechanisms. Reform works when it rewires the machine. That is not a rebuttal to the thesis. It is the thesis gaining historical evidence. Responsibility. This objection is morally indispensable, not just rhetorically common. Structural language can sound to a hostile reader like a laundering device. If systems explain everything, then nobody did anything. If incentives are destiny, then guilt dissolves into process maps. That would be a serious moral and legal defect. The objection therefore insists, correctly, that institutions act through people, that people make decisions, and that blame cannot be evacuated into abstractions without destroying accountability itself. The objection fails because structural analysis does not blur responsibility. It sharpens it. It asks who chose the metric, who designed the escalation channel, who narrowed the safety analysis, who preserved the quota, who approved the scorecard, who buried the warning, who accepted the proxy, who decided the evaluator would be internal rather than external. Those are more precise questions than vague moral condemnation ever produces. The difference between saying Boeing was greedy and saying a certification structure left independent review materially constrained while deceptive omissions about MCAS reached the FAA is not that the second is softer. It is that the second gives accountability a mechanism and therefore a target. Structural diagnosis is not an alibi. It is what prevents accountability from stopping at the level of bad feelings and scapegoated subordinates. Boundary conditions. This is the most technically serious objection in the chapter, and it is right about something the earlier sections do not fully address. It says, in essence, that the good AI cases in Chapter 9 benefit from unusually clean domains. AlphaFold lives in a benchmark-rich scientific environment. GraphCast predicts against an atmosphere that does not negotiate. IDX-DR operated under a regulated clinical framework with a relatively crisp task. These are not justice, education, social media, or welfare administration. Where the target is contested, the data are politically loaded, and the outcome is not cleanly measurable. This objection is right to a point. Domain difficulty matters. Ground truth is not equally available everywhere. What it does not show is that the redesigned principles fail. It shows where they are hardest to implement. Compass makes the point sharply. Kleinberg, Mullainathan, and Raghavan prove that competing fairness conditions cannot generally all be satisfied at once when base rates differ. That does not mean structural alignment is impossible. It means the fairness choice has to be made explicitly, validated externally where possible, and governed as a contested institutional decision, rather than smuggled in under the label of neutral computation. Hard domains do not invalidate the thesis. They expose how costly misalignment becomes when evaluation is weak, proxies are political, and institutions still pretend their outputs are merely technical. The comparison is not between perfect alignment and none. It is between explicit structural discipline and opaque drift. That comparison is not close. The core survives. Taken together, the objections do not collapse the thesis. They specify its boundaries. Agency exists, but it is not a reliable institutional control at scale. Culture matters, but durable culture usually rides on structure. Reform is real, But successful reform rewires design, rather than merely expressing remorse. Responsibility remains personal, but structural analysis is what identifies where responsibility actually sits. Domain difficulty is real, but harder domains increase the need for explicit external validation and disciplined proxies, rather than reducing it. The thesis therefore survives not as a universal law of total determination, but as a claim of probabilistic dominance. Systems produce what they are wired to reward with enough consistency that they remain the primary variable in explaining institutional outcomes. That is enough. A theory does not have to explain everything to reorganize how you see almost everything that matters. The next chapter stops arguing and starts instructing. If the mechanism holds, and if the objections refine rather than destroy it, then the only serious remaining question is what actually rewires the machine. That is Chapter 11.
Part 5. The Redesign.
Chapter 11. 3 moves that rewire the machine. The case chapters do not point toward 100 reforms. They point toward 3. That is the useful thing about evidence when people stop using it as decoration. Boeing, Purdue, Challenger, Wells Fargo, Compass, Optum, and Meta fail in different domains, at different speeds, and with different moral atmospheres. AlphaFold, IDX-DR, and GraphCast succeed under very different conditions. But once the noise drops away, the structural differences are not endless. They converge. The distorted systems relied on bad proxies, cheap drift, and slow correction. The aligned systems were anchored to better targets, exposed to external validation, and checked fast enough that failure could not quietly harden into normal operation. These are not policy preferences. They are engineering conclusions read back out of the cases. The 3 moves are these: invert the core metrics, raise the cost of drift, shorten the feedback loops. They are not exhaustive. Hard domains will still require local judgment, politics, trade-offs, and institutional stamina. But they are the floor. Below them, redesign reliably fails. Above them, alignment at least becomes structurally possible. Invert the core metrics. Most institutional failure begins as proxy failure. Boeing did not optimize safe aircraft operation under real-world pilot interaction. It optimized preserving 737 commonality and avoiding simulator training disruption inside a commercial and certification frame. Optum did not optimize health need. It optimized future cost. Wells Fargo did not optimize customer welfare. It optimized product count. Meta did not optimize human connection. It optimized engagement. In each case, the proxy was easier to count, easier to defend administratively, and easier to scale than the declared purpose. That convenience is exactly why it became dangerous. The first redesign move is therefore not choose better values. It is force the system to count something closer to what it actually claims to care about. If the claim is aircraft safety, the metric cannot be pilot transition convenience plus after-the-fact incident response. If the claim is equitable care allocation, the target cannot be spending. If the claim is fair risk assessment, the institution cannot smuggle a contested fairness definition into deployment and then pretend the outcome is neutral because a model produced it. A system cannot align with a purpose it does not measure. The aligned cases show the inverse. AlphaFold was judged against blind benchmark performance on protein structure prediction, not against an internal growth proxy. IDX-DR had to show prospective clinical performance against an external reference standard under a regulated review pathway. GraphCast lives in a domain where forecast quality is continuously checked against the atmosphere rather than against an internally flattering substitute. The reason these systems align better is not that their builders were purer. It is that the target was tighter. This move sounds simple until it collides with institutional life. Direct measures are often slower, harder, and more politically expensive than proxies. That is why organizations drift toward the proxy in the first place. And even when they try to correct, they often just swap one bad proxy for a shinier one. The answer is not metric purity theater. It is multidimensional validation against external outcomes that the institution does not fully control. A better metric is one that stays answerable to reality instead of to the dashboard that generated it. Raise the cost of drift. The second move begins where most systems rot. Drift stays cheap. At Boeing, repeated internal concern about MCAS and the broader certification process did not create decisive commercial pain until after 2 crashes and federal action. At Purdue, the 2007 guilty plea and corporate integrity agreement still failed to stop later conduct that federal prosecutors said ran from 2007 through 2018. At Wells Fargo, years of gaming, whistleblower signals, and ethics complaints did not make the sales model too expensive to keep. That is what cheap drift looks like. A system drifts when the people authorizing distortion do not personally and automatically bear the cost of it at the point where the distortion is being normalized. This does not mean ritual public firings every time something goes wrong. It means that once a threshold is crossed, there must be consequences that attach to the decision layer fast enough and specifically enough to alter behavior before the harm becomes the new normal. If the institution can classify warnings, settle claims, rotate personnel, issue guidance, and continue, then drift remains affordable. Affordable drift becomes policy. Again, the aligned cases point the other way. IDX-DR was authorized inside a framework with pre-specified performance evidence, labeling, human factors validation, and change control expectations. AlphaFold exposed confidence scores and then released outputs into a scientific environment where overstatement could be tested by others. GraphCast is checked in public-facing forecasting environments where failure is hard to hide for long because tomorrow keeps arriving in a remarkably uncooperative way. These systems are not magically immune to error. They simply operate where drift is less cheap. There is a second-order risk here too. If raise the cost of drift is implemented badly, people start suppressing the very signals the system needs. Fearful organizations go quiet. That is why accountability architecture has to be paired with protected escalation channels and whistleblower safety. The aim is not terror. The aim is to make it harder to preserve a distortion once it is visible. In other words, expensive drift, cheap truth. Shorten the feedback loops. The third move is temporal. Systems fail differently depending on how long they can keep producing bad output before reality pushes back. Boeing had years between design, warning, first crash, second crash, and criminal resolution. Purdue had more than a decade between its first federal plea and its later federal reckoning. Wells Fargo's sales practice misconduct persisted for years before the public enforcement wave. In each case, the correction loop was slower than the system's capacity to scale harm. That asymmetry is fatal. If a machine can spread damage faster than signals can be aggregated, validated, and acted on, then hindsight becomes the dominant governance model. Hindsight is a terrible safety system. Shortening the loop means building correction into the operating rhythm of the system rather than waiting for scandal, litigation, or journalists to do the work. GraphCast is the cleanest demonstration because forecast skill is continuously exposed to an external reality the model cannot negotiate with. AlphaFold's benchmark discipline and open database mean claims can be checked relatively quickly by a broader scientific community. IDX-DR's authorization pathway forced evidence up front, rather than allowing deployment first and regret later. The common feature is not technology. It is correction speed. For AI systems specifically, this means 4 practical requirements. The objective function has to be tied to a verifiable real-world outcome, not just a convenient internal proxy. Performance monitoring has to occur after deployment, not only before it. Escalation channels have to reach people with authority to halt or materially alter the system. And the interval between harm signal and system adjustment has to be shorter than the interval in which the system can scale the harm. If the model can touch millions before the first serious review cycle closes, the feedback loop is decorative. This move also has its own corruption risk. Dashboards become targets. Teams optimize to the reporting layer rather than the underlying outcome. Goodhart's law is not a clever aside here. It is the permanent parasite on institutional measurement. The answer is the same as before. External verification, multiple measures, and periodic exposure to realities the institution cannot redefine. A fast loop that only measures internal self-congratulation is just faster drift. The three together. These principles are not interchangeable. A system that measures the right thing but allows drift to stay cheap will still rot. A system that punishes drift but uses the wrong proxy will punish people into optimizing nonsense. A system with decent metrics and real accountability, but glacial correction speed, will still produce harm faster than it can learn. That is why 2 out of 3 is not enough. Distorted institutions often have 1 or even 2 surface-level virtues. The failures in this book endured because one weak link was enough to let the machine keep training behavior in the wrong direction. The aligned cases work better because all 3 conditions appear together, even if imperfectly. AlphaFold had a strong target and external validation, plus uncertainty, signaling, and broad inspection. IDX-DR had pre-specified evidence thresholds, regulated review, and explicit controls around performance and change. GraphCast has continuous external verification and rapid correction pressure in a domain where the ground truth does not wait for committee consensus. That combination is what Chapter 9 was really showing: structural alignment. Instruction. The redesign answer is therefore not mysterious. Find the proxy and replace it with something closer to the declared purpose. Make drift expensive at the point where it starts, rather than after catastrophe. Build correction loops that run faster than the system can scale harm. Those are the 3 moves. They are not inspirational. They are not comprehensive. They are not easy. They are simply what the evidence keeps demanding once you stop asking institutions what they value and start examining what their design lets them do. Who actually imposes these moves when the people best positioned to do so are usually the ones most rewarded by the current machine? That problem is not technical. It is political economy. Chapter 12. The political economy of redesign. The diagnosis is technical. The obstacle is political. By Chapter 11, the redesign principles should be clear enough to feel almost obvious. Invert the core metrics, raise the cost of drift, shorten the feedback loops. The problem is that the people best positioned to do those things are usually the people most rewarded by the current machine. They own the proxy, control the reporting chain, benefit from the lag, and can survive the damage longer than the public can. This is why correct diagnosis so often produces cosmetic reform. The institution does not need to refute the critique. It only needs to absorb it without surrendering the objective function. That is why redesign is not mainly a design problem. It is a leverage problem. The question is not, what would a better system look like? The question is, what conditions ever force a profitable, comfortable, politically defended system to become a different one? Across the cases in this book, 3 drivers recur: catastrophic visible failure, external regulatory pressure with real enforcement power, and externally validated performance environments in which aligned design beats distorted design. None is guaranteed. None is clean. But these are the main ways the machine is ever made to care. Catastrophic visible failure. The first driver is the oldest and the ugliest, public disaster so visible that the institution cannot plausibly manage it as noise. Challenger is the model case because the failure was unmistakable, the victims were visible, and the causal chain could not be contained inside the organization. NASA responded quickly with an implementation plan for the Rogers Commission recommendations and created an associate administrator-level safety office reporting to the NASA administrator. That is what visible failure can do at first impact. It can force action, create offices, generate milestones, and temporarily increase the authority of safety over schedule. But visible failure does not automatically produce durable redesign. GAO reported in 1990 that despite the post-Challenger safety reorganization, field center safety organizations were still not fully independent because they received most of their funding from the very programs whose safety they were meant to oversee. More than 90% of those field center safety budgets came from the activities under their review. 58. That is the political economy problem in miniature. Even after catastrophe, institutions rebuild reform in ways that preserve dependence where dependence is comfortable. Columbia sharpened the lesson. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board's supplementary materials state that NASA had repeatedly demonstrated a lack of regard for outside studies and their findings, and noted that investigators examined more than 50 post-Challenger reports while assessing how much had and had not changed. 59. In other words, one visible disaster had produced reform, but not enough reform to prevent another disaster built from familiar organizational logic. After Columbia, NASA's return-to-flight plan included CAIB Recommendation 7.5-1 for an independent technical engineering authority, responsible for technical requirements and waivers, explicitly funded from headquarters, and disconnected from schedule or program cost. 60. That is deeper rewiring because it changes authority, not just posture. So catastrophic visible failure can work, but only under certain conditions. The harm has to be attributable, impossible to localize into a few bad actors, and politically expensive to ignore. Then the reform has to alter authority gradients, funding lines, and override powers rather than merely producing new language about safety culture. Otherwise, the tragedy becomes an anniversary speech, and the machine survives. External regulatory pressure. The second driver is external regulation with enough authority to matter before the damage fully scales. The cleanest counterexample to drift by default in this book is IDX-DR. FDA's de novo order classified the device into Class 2 and imposed special controls to provide reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, including specified indications for use, evidence requirements, and device-specific controls. 61. The point is not that the FDA is magically wiser than every other institution. The point is that the deploying organization did not get to define success unilaterally after deployment. A regulator imposed a threshold structure in advance. That is what enforcement power looks like when it is used to operationalize the redesign principles before the system becomes too normal to challenge. This is also why so much regulation fails. Regulation without enforcement authority becomes compliance theater. Regulation after the machine has already trained the market, normalized the proxy, and fragmented the harms becomes documentation. The distinction is not between regulation and no regulation. It is between regulation that can force changes in metrics, costs, and feedback timing, and regulation that merely adds paperwork to the same incentive structure. Boeing and Purdue both demonstrate what happens when formal oversight exists, but the organization can still absorb risk information and continue. IDX-DR shows what happens when regulatory design bites earlier and more directly. Externally validated performance environments. Chapter 9 established why externally validated performance environments work. When an institution cannot redefine failure as success, the correction loop is harder to evade. The political economy question is different. It is not what makes aligned systems work in principle. It is what makes them possible when the dominant institution benefits from defining success internally. When the people best positioned to impose external validation are the same people most rewarded by its absence. AlphaFold required CASP. IDX-DR required FDA's de novo pathway. GraphCast requires the atmosphere to keep arriving. In each case, the governance condition was an external actor the deploying institution did not control. 67. The harder political economy question is what forces that condition into existence when the incumbent institution has every incentive to resist it. AI changes the leverage landscape. AI makes all three drivers harder to activate in time. First, the speed problem. Automated systems can scale harmful outputs across millions of cases before regulators, journalists, or injured parties even understand what target was being optimized. Second, the visibility problem. When the harm appears as a model output, an accuracy score, or a ranking decision, institutions can present the result as technical rather than political. Third, the concentration problem. A relatively small number of organizations now choose objective functions for systems that mediate information, credit, care allocation, moderation, and recommendation at enormous scale. The old leverage points still exist, but the machine now moves faster than many of the mechanisms meant to discipline it. That is not a new law of nature. It is just the usual mismatch between industrial speed and human oversight, upgraded for the software age. This is why the four-question operational test matters so much. It is not a complete governance solution. It is a way of forcing political economy questions upstream before the institution can hide behind technical inevitability. Who chose the target? What distorted history is embedded in the data? What incentives surround deployment? What feedback loop is faster than the harm? If those questions do not have public answers, the machine has already been given too much trust. The whistleblower as structural actor. Whistleblowers matter, but not because hero stories are satisfying. Boisjoli's 1985 memo did not stop Challenger. The signal arrived, but the decision structure treated it as something management could absorb. Boeing's internal messages and test knowledge did not stop the MAX either. They became decisive only after crashes, investigations, and federal action. Frances Haugen's testimony mattered because it moved Meta's internal research and conflict structure into public view, telling Congress that company leadership kept vital information from the public and had repeatedly misled outsiders about what its own research showed about safety and polarization. 62. That is a different outcome from Boisjoli's and Boeing's, not because the whistleblower is morally superior, but because the signal escaped the institution and acquired outside audiences with at least some power to react. The structural lesson is simple. Whistleblowing produces redesign only when the warning can reach an external mechanism stronger than the institution's internal interest in containment. Otherwise, it becomes one more document in the archive of ignored warnings. The heroism is real. The leverage is conditional. The hard conclusion. Redesign is not inevitable. It is not even especially likely. The machine usually stays in place because it is profitable, legible, and defended by the people who understand it best. Catastrophic failure can break that equilibrium, but only if the failure is public enough and the reform is structural enough. Regulation can help, but only if it arrives with authority and timing instead of memo writing. External performance environments can discipline institutions, but only where reality stays available and contestable enough to function as judge. That is the honest answer. Not optimism, not despair, just mechanism. The next chapter closes the book by compressing all of this into instruction. That instruction is not a slogan. It is what remains after the evidence, the objections, and the political economy have all had their turn. Chapter 13. Close the gap. Human beings do not rise to the level of their ideals. They fall to the level of their systems. What institutions reward, punish, measure, ignore, and make frictionless becomes normal. Design sets the metric, incentives distribute the pressure, people adapt, drift sets in, distortion stabilizes, and human consequences follow. Leave that chain intact, and the output repeats. Whether the institution is building aircraft, selling painkillers, launching shuttles, opening bank accounts, ranking defendants, allocating care, or sorting the world through machines that operate at planetary scale. That is the engineering problem this book has traced from beginning to end, the gap between what institutions announce and what they are wired to produce. The public language is usually admirable. Safety, integrity, health, fairness, connection, accountability, service. Those words are cheap, not because they are false in every mouth, but because they do not govern behavior on their own. Operational design governs behavior. Metrics govern behavior. Incentives govern behavior. Feedback loops govern behavior. If those elements are aligned with the stated purpose, declared value can scale. If they are not, the institution will reliably produce something else and call it by a better name. That is why the cases in this book do not belong to separate moral universes. Boeing did not fail because aviation is uniquely corrupt. Purdue did not fail because pharmaceuticals attract uniquely bad people. Challenger was not destroyed by a tragic misunderstanding. Wells Fargo was not built by a special breed of fraudster. Compass, Optum, and Meta are not warnings about evil machines arriving from nowhere. They are instances of the same underlying fact. When the system counts the wrong thing, protects the wrong thing, and delays correction long enough, the machine trains distortion and then scales it. The inverse is also true. AlphaFold, IDX-DR, and GraphCast do not matter because they restore faith in technology or because they prove that good intentions eventually win. They matter because they show the symmetry of the thesis. When the target is tighter, when validation is external, when uncertainty is legible, and when correction arrives before distortion hardens into normal operation, the same machinery can scale declared value with remarkable fidelity. The system is not biased toward wisdom or toward harm. It is biased toward whatever it is designed to reward. That is the whole argument, compressed. If you want different behavior, change the system that trains it. If you want different institutional output, change the metric that governs it. If you want safety to matter, make safety decisive in the design rather than decorative in the mission statement. This is why outrage is not enough. Exposure is not enough. Punishment is not enough. Better people are not enough. Institutions can survive scandal, absorb fines, replace executives, publish apologies, and continue because none of those things necessarily alter the objective function. The machine does not reform because it has been criticized. It reforms when the thing it is rewarded for producing is different. The system is not broken. It is working as designed. That is the problem. That is also the solution. Find the metric. Change what it counts. Then raise the cost of drift and shorten the feedback loop. The rest is physics.
Appendix A.
Secondary case studies. These cases do not sit in the main body because their primary lessons are already carried by the anchor chapters, their evidentiary chains are less complete, or their analytical role is narrower. They still matter because each shows the mechanism from a different angle. Volkswagen Clean Diesel. Public claim. Clean diesel, high performance, regulatory compliance. Operational reality. EPA's 2015. Notice of violation alleged Volkswagen installed software that detected when cars were being tested and reduced emissions controls during normal driving, causing certain 2009 to 2015 diesel vehicles to emit up to 40 times the legal NOx standard. 63. Incentive structure. Preserve diesel marketability, performance, and certification without paying the engineering and commercial cost of genuine compliance. The defeat device is the clearest design fraud example in the project because the gap between certified performance and real-world operation was built into the software itself. Ignored warnings/signal handling. The company sustained the system until regulators and outside researchers forced the issue. EPA notes the investigation followed independent emissions analysis and Volkswagen's eventual admission in September 2015. Human adaptation. Engineers and managers operated inside a system where passing the test mattered more than controlling emissions in use. Predictable harm, unlawful pollution at scale, and a fraudulent compliance regime rather than isolated technical error. Structural lesson. Volkswagen is the strongest intentional gap engineering case in the book's orbit. The system did not drift into distortion. It encoded distortion as the method of passing review. Credit rating agencies and the 2008 crisis. Public claim. Independent assessment of credit risk. Operational reality. The FCIC and its staff reports describe a market in which rating agencies earned fees when securities were issued and rated, helping sustain demand for mortgage-backed securities and CDOs whose ratings later collapsed. FCIC staff specifically warned that inflated initial ratings may have contributed to the crisis by enabling more issuance and greater investor demand. 64. Incentive structure. Issuer pays compensation meant the gatekeeper was paid by the party seeking the favorable judgment. That is the entire mechanism in one line. Risk judgment sold inside the transaction it is supposed to police. Ignored warnings/signal handling. The buildup of low documentation and subprime exposure was visible in the broader mortgage machine, while highly rated securities kept feeding investor demand. FCIC's report links those ratings directly to the expansion of risky mortgage finance. Human adaptation. Originators, structurers, and investors treated ratings as tradable legitimacy because the system rewarded issuance volume and fee generation. Predictable harm. Mass downgrades, losses, and cascading financial instability once the underlying loans failed. Structural lesson. This is the financial sector version of Boeing's delegated certification problem. The evaluator's business model was tied to the continuation of the thing it was supposed to judge independently. No child left behind. Public claim, accountability, proficiency, and closing achievement gaps. Operational reality. The policy made test performance the dominant, legible output. Over time, a substantial research literature argued that high-stakes accountability distorted instruction, narrowed curriculum, and encouraged indicator corruption and teaching to the test behavior. Incentive structure. Schools and districts faced escalating sanctions if AYP targets were missed, so measured proficiency became the number that mattered operationally, even when broader learning goals were publicly invoked. Ignored warnings/signal handling. Critics and researchers repeatedly argued that the law's indicator structure would distort behavior. Meanwhile, retrospective reviews argued NCLB failed to produce the gains promised while imposing those distortions. Human adaptation. Schools rationally shifted effort toward tested subjects, tested students, and threshold performance. Predictable harm. Narrowed instruction, strategic gaming pressures, and a policy environment where what counted on the exam displaced what mattered educationally. Structural lesson. NCLB belongs here because it shows the mechanism in public policy form. It is the strongest broad audience case for how metric inversion can go wrong, even when the declared purpose is morally serious. Meta platforms. Full institutional anatomy. Public claim, connection, community, and giving people voice. Operational reality. Haugen's Senate testimony says Facebook repeatedly encountered conflicts between profit and safety and repeatedly resolved them in favor of profit, while internal reporting described harms involving teen mental health, weak integrity protections, and major safety gaps outside core markets. Incentive structure. Engagement-based ranking and scale-based deployment meant content that held attention, provoked reaction, or intensified identity conflict could outperform content more closely aligned with the public mission. That is the proxy failure. Engagement functioning as if it were connection. Ignored warnings/signal handling. This is why Meta appears twice in the project. In Chapter 8, it serves as an amplification case. Here, the emphasis is signal suppression. Internal research and employee warnings existed, but the integrity function did not consistently acquire enough authority to override growth and ranking incentives. Human adaptation. Teams learn to manage harms inside the growth machine instead of letting those harms govern the machine. Predictable harm, teen mental health damage, weak moderation in high-risk contexts, and repeated public understatement of internal findings. Structural lesson. Meta is the clearest modern signal suppression case. The warning did not fail to arrive. It failed to gain override authority against the metric architecture. Amazon recruiting tool. Public claim. More efficient, data-driven hiring. Operational reality. Amazon scrapped an internal recruiting tool after specialists found it downgraded resumes containing indicators associated with women, because the system had been trained on 10 years of resumes that reflected male dominance in the company's technical hiring patterns. Incentive structure. Automate candidate screening using historical success patterns and managerial efficiency rather than interrogating whether the historical record itself encoded discrimination. Ignored warnings/signal handling. The company discovered the problem internally and abandoned the tool before full production deployment, which is exactly why this is an appendix case rather than a main proof case. The chain did not run to completion at societal scale. Human adaptation. The design inherited the past and treated it as a hiring template. Predictable harm. Systematic downgrading of female-coded resumes if deployed as intended. Structural lesson. Amazon's tool is useful because it isolates the objective function as history problem. The model did not invent sexism. It operationalized the hiring record it was given and would have scaled it had the system not been stopped. Appendix A exists to widen the lens without bloating the proof section. The mechanism does not belong to one sector. It survives translation embarrassingly well.
Appendix B. Objection reference. This appendix is the compressed version of Chapter 10. It exists for readers who want the objections and answers in usable reference form for debate, teaching, or adversarial review. The full argument is in Chapter 10. What follows is the operational extract. Agency. Strongest form. Individuals can and do refuse, dissent, and act against institutional pressure, which means systems cannot be the dominant variable. Agency is real but unreliable as an institutional control at scale. In every major case in this book, someone saw the problem, and the institution continued anyway. The relevant test is not whether resistance exists, it is whether resistance wins often enough at population scale to govern the organization more reliably than the incentive structure does. Case anchor, Boisjoli's 1985 memo. The warning was written, escalated and formalized. The shuttle launched. Culture, strongest form. High reliability organizations demonstrate that culture, not just structure, can make institutions perform safely under extreme risk. Durable safety culture in HROs is not atmospheric virtue. It is an organized repertoire, protected escalation channels, authority gradients that let expertise override rank, error reporting systems that do not punish truth-telling. Remove the structural supports and the culture decays into aspiration within one leadership cycle. Case anchor, post-Challenger NASA safety culture, which the GAO found still compromised by funding dependence in 1990 despite reorganization. Reform. Strongest form. Institutions do change. NASA after Challenger, NASA after Columbia, FDA's de novo framework, which means structural analysis overstates its case. These examples confirm, rather than defeat, the thesis. Post-Columbia's CAIB recommendation 7.5-1 worked because it changed authority gradients and funding lines, not because NASA declared better values. FDA de novo worked because it operationalized pre-specified evidence thresholds before deployment, not because it trusted good intentions. Successful reform rewires design. That is the thesis gaining historical evidence, not losing it. Case Anchor, Post-Columbia Independent Technical Engineering Authority, funded from headquarters and explicitly disconnected from schedule or program cost. Responsibility, strongest form. If systems explain institutional outcomes, then nobody did anything. Structural analysis launders accountability into process maps. Structural analysis does not blur responsibility, it sharpens it. The question is not, was anyone responsible, but who chose the metric, who designed the escalation channel, who narrowed the safety analysis, who preserved the quota after recognition. Those are more precise questions than moral condemnation produces. The difference between Boeing was greedy and a certification structure left independent review materially constrained while deceptive omissions about MCAS reached the FAA is not that the second is softer, it is that the second identifies a mechanism and therefore a target. Case Anchor, DOJ. Statement of Facts, United States versus the Boeing Company. Deception attributed to identified employees performing identified acts in an identified structural context. Boundary conditions. Strongest form. The aligned cases in Chapter 9 operate in unusually clean domains, blind benchmarks, atmospheric ground truth, regulated clinical tasks, which do not generalize to justice, education, welfare, or social media. This objection is partly right, and that matters. Domain difficulty is real. Ground truth is not equally available everywhere. What the objection does not show is that redesign principles fail in hard domains. It shows where they are hardest to implement. Hard domains do not reduce the need for explicit proxy control and external validation. They increase the danger of abandoning it, because when evaluation is weak and the institution controls its own measurement layer, contested choices get laundered into technical outputs with no legible accountability. Case Anchor, Kleinberg, Melanathan, and Raghavan on fairness impossibility, the formal proof that in hard domains, competing fairness conditions cannot all be satisfied simultaneously, which means the choice has to be made explicitly rather than buried. Cynicism, strongest form. The book's repeated denial of institutional moral self-descriptions is just cynicism dressed in systems language. Cynicism says ideals are fake and improvement is impossible. This book says neither. It says ideals are real but operationally weak unless translated into design. That is not cynicism. It is a refusal to confuse aspiration with architecture. The argument is severe because the mechanism is severe. Appendix C.
The operational test. This appendix is not a theory. It is a pre-deployment instrument. Use it before a system is launched, scaled, renewed, or defended. Use it when someone says the model is accurate, the policy is evidence-based, the incentive plan is standard, the ranking system is neutral, or the dashboard is working. This test exists to make them earn it. A system does not have to fail all 4 questions to be dangerous. Failing one clearly can be enough. Failing several is how organizations end up acting shocked by outcomes they practically commissioned. 1. Who chose the objective function, and what were their incentives when they chose it? Every system optimizes something, whether it admits it or not. The first question is not what the institution says it wants. It is who decided what the system would actually count, reward, minimize, prioritize, or predict. A target is never neutral just because it is mathematical, administrative, or embedded in software. Someone selected it. Someone accepted the trade-offs built into it. Someone benefited from its convenience. Ask, what exact outcome is the system optimizing? Who selected that outcome? What commercial, bureaucratic, legal, or reputational incentives surrounded that choice? What alternative targets were rejected? What harms become easier to ignore because this target is easier to count? If the answer is vague, outsourced, or hidden inside technical language, the system is already telling you something. 2. What distortions are baked into the training data, target variable, or operating history? No system begins fresh. It inherits a past. That past may be statistical, organizational, procedural, legal, or cultural. The question is not whether the data are imperfect. They always are. The question is whether the system is inheriting a pattern of distortion and then laundering it into a recommendation, score, priority list, or performance metric that appears objective because it is now machine readable. Ask, what historical conditions produced the data? What populations were overcounted, undercounted, excluded, misclassified, or harmed in the process? Does the target variable reflect the true outcome or only a shadow of it? What does the model learn from unequal access, unequal scrutiny, unequal enforcement, or unequal opportunity? Has anyone independent tested for those distortions directly? If no one can answer these questions cleanly, the institution is not deploying intelligence. It is deploying sediment. 3. What incentives surround deployment? Even a well-designed tool can be deployed inside a bad machine. This question forces attention away from the model or policy in isolation and toward the system around it. A tool does not enter a vacuum. It enters compensation plans, launch schedules, growth targets, performance reviews, market expectations, staffing limits, legal exposure, and internal politics. Those surrounding incentives often determine what the tool will become more reliably than the tool's technical design does. Ask, who gains if the system is deployed quickly? Who loses if deployment is delayed, narrowed, or halted? What revenue, prestige, staffing, or performance pressure is attached to rollout? Who has authority to challenge deployment, and what do they risk by doing so? Are safety, fairness, or validity constraints operationally stronger than the incentive to scale? If deployment incentives favor speed, growth, and defensibility while correction is slow or costly, the system is not being launched into neutral terrain. It is being launched into a machine that already has an answer it prefers. 4. What feedback loops exist for correction, and are they faster than the system's capacity to scale harm? This is the question most institutions answer last, vaguely or dishonestly. They say there will be review. They say complaints will be monitored. They say the team will learn. They say continuous improvement, as if that phrase were a control system instead of a prayer. None of that matters if the system can scale harm faster than anyone can detect, validate, escalate, and correct it. Ask, what signals trigger review? Who sees those signals? Who has authority to pause, modify, or terminate the system? How long does it take for a known problem to alter operation? Can the system affect thousands, millions, or billions before the first serious correction cycle closes? Are the feedback signals external and independently verifiable, or internal and self-serving? If correction depends on scandal, litigation, whistleblowers, congressional outrage, or mass casualties, the feedback loop is not a safeguard. It is an obituary schedule. How to read the results. If a system fails, question 1, it is probably chasing the wrong thing. If it fails, question 2, it is probably inheriting distortion and calling it evidence. If it fails, question 3, its deployment environment is likely to overpower internal caution. If it fails, question 4, it will probably scale harm faster than it can learn. A system that fails all 4 should not be trusted. A system that fails 2 or 3 is already in dangerous territory. A system that clears all 4 still requires judgment, but at least it has entered the argument honestly. That is the point of the test. Not to prove a system is perfect, to expose whether the institution around it is structured to deserve trust before trust is granted. One-page version. 1. Who chose the objective function, and what were their incentives when they chose it? What is the system really optimizing? Who decided that? And what did they gain from choosing it? 2. What distortions are baked into the training data, target variable, or operating history? What unequal past is being imported into the present and mistaken for neutral evidence? 3. What incentives surround deployment? Who benefits from rollout? Who pays for caution? And does anyone with real authority have a reason to stop the system? 4. What feedback loops exist for correction, and are they faster than the system's capacity to scale harm? Can the system be corrected before it causes damage at scale, or only after? Appendix C is the book in executable form. Find the metric, find the proxy. Find the incentive, find the lag. That is where the truth is.
Endnotes. Chapter 1. 1V. A. Office of Inspector General, review of alleged patient deaths, patient wait times, and scheduling practices at the Phoenix VA healthcare system, report number 14-02603-267, Washington, D.C., Department of Veterans Affairs, August 26, 2014. The report identified 40 patients who died while on the Phoenix electronic wait list, but stated it could not conclusively assert that lack of timely care caused those deaths. It documented clinically significant delays, unofficial wait lists, unreliable reported wait times, leadership awareness of access delays, and systemic inappropriate scheduling practices across VHA. 2. Thomas S.D. and Brian Jacob, The Impact of No Child Left Behind on Student Achievement, Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. 30, number 3, 2011, 418 to 446, Daniel Ho, Evaluating the Impact of No Child Left Behind on NAEP Reading Scores, Georgetown University Working Paper, 2008. Derek Neal and Diane Whitmore Schanzenbach, Left Behind by Design, Proficiency Counts and Test-Based Accountability, Review of Economics and Statistics. 92, number 2, 2010, 263 to 283. See also Thomas S.D., Brian Jacob, and Nathaniel L. Schwartz, The Effects of NCLB on School Resources and Practices, Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis, 35, number 2, 2013, 252 to 279. Chapter 4. 3. U.S. House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, Final Committee. Report the design, development, and certification of the Boeing 737 MAX, Washington, D.C., U.S. House of Representatives, September 2020, 14 to 16. The committee's investigation documented the Southwest Penalty Clause in materials entered into the congressional record. 4. FAA Joint Authorities Technical Review, Boeing 737 MAX Flight Control System. Observations, Findings, and Recommendations. Washington, D.C., Federal Aviation Administration, November 2019, 5 to 7. The JATR panel found that FAA technical staff lacked the resources, tools, and organizational authority to independently challenge Boeing's safety analyses on MCAS and were dependent on Boeing's own analysis. 5. JATR Report 8 to 12. The report found that the system safety analysis classification of a runaway stabilizer as catastrophic was not adequately supported by Boeing's submitted analysis, which understated the operational risk. 6. House Committee Final Report 65 to 79. Internal materials reviewed by congressional investigators, including Boeing flight test records, documented the MCAS failure mode prior to certification. 7. Statement of Facts, United States versus the Boeing Company, Criminal Number 4:21-CR-0005-0 ND-TEX, January 7, 2021, paragraphs 15 to 28. Boeing admitted that 2 employees, provided false, inaccurate, and incomplete information to the FAA's Aircraft Evaluation Group regarding MCAS during the certification process. Boeing Internal Communications reproduced in House Committee Final Report 80 to 95. The designed by clowns and Jedi mind trick messages were among internal communications entered into the congressional record during the committee's investigation. In Komite Nasional Keselamatan Transportasi (KNKT) Aircraft Accident Investigation, Report PT Lion Mentari Airlines Boeing 737-8 MAX PK-LQP Report number KNKT.18.10.35.04 Jakarta KNKT October 2019. 10 Ethiopian Accident Investigation Bureau Aircraft Accident Investigation Preliminary Report Ethiopian Airlines Group Boeing 737-8 MAX ET-AVJ Report number AI-01/19 Addis Ababa Ethiopian Civil Aviation Authority 2020. 11 Federal Aviation Administration Emergency Order of Prohibition Docket number FAA-2019-0118 Washington, D.C. FAA March 13, 2019. 12 Deferred Prosecution Agreement United States versus the Boeing Company Criminal number 4:21-CR-0005-0 NDTEX January 7, 2021. The $2.5 billion total consisted of a $243.6 million criminal fine, $1.77 billion in compensation to Boeing's airline customers, and a $500 million crash victim fund. Chapter 5. 13. Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Purdue Pharma LP et al. First amended complaint, Suffolk Superior Court, January 31, 2019. Paragraphs 244 to 252. The complaint incorporates board-level compensation and Toppers Club materials drawn from internal Purdue documents. 14. Massachusetts AG complaint, paragraphs 248 to 250. The report described to the board in October 2008 characterized OxyContin abuse and diversion as geographically widespread and tied to product availability and prescribing practices. 15. Massachusetts AG complaint, January 31, 2019. The allegations regarding the October 2008 board sequence are drawn from this complaint and parallel state filings. Purdue did not successfully contest this characterization before the bankruptcy resolution. See also U.S. Department of Justice, Purdue Pharma Federal Information and Plea Agreement, October 21, 2020. 16. U.S. Attorney's Office, Western District of Virginia, Press Release and Plea Materials, United States versus Purdue Frederick Company, Inc., May 10, 2007. The $634,515,475 resolution included criminal fines and civil settlements. 17. U.S. Department of Justice, Federal Information, United States versus Purdue Pharma LP, October 21, 2020, paragraphs 12 to 28. The information alleged that the conduct described ran from May 2007 through February 2018. 18. U.S. Department of Justice, Plea Agreement with Purdue Pharma LP, Statement of Facts, October 2020, paragraphs 5, 111 to 114, identifying the Evolve to Excellence program, intensified promotion to highest volume prescribers, and the company's continuation of aggressive sales practices after the 2007 conviction. See also U.S. Department of Justice, Settlement Agreement with members of the Sackler family, Addendum A, October 2020, paragraphs 4 to 5, 81 to 90, 103 to 110, Board and Sackler family approval and implementation detail. McKinsey & Company, Settlement Agreement with State Attorneys General, February 4, 2021. McKinsey agreed to pay approximately $573 million to resolve claims regarding its advisory role in Purdue's sales strategy. 19. William N. Evans, Ethan M. J. Lieber, and Patrick Power. How the reformulation of OxyContin ignited the heroin epidemic. The Review of Economics and Statistics. 101 number 1, March 2019. 1 to 15, https://doi.org/10.162/REST_A_00755 NBER Working Paper number 24475, April 2018, https://doi.org/10.3386/W24475. 20 DOJ Federal Information, October 21, 2020, paragraphs 30 to 45. The charges included conspiracy to defraud the United States by impairing the DEA's regulatory functions, unlawful kickback activity, and continuation of conduct designed to maximize profits while undermining regulatory constraints. Chapter 6. 21. Report of the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger Accident, Rogers Commission Report, Volume 1, Washington, D.C., U.S. Government Printing Office, June 6, 1986, 40 to 72. The Commission traced the O-ring joint problem to at least 1977 and described the disaster as an accident rooted in history. 22. Roger Boisjoli, Memorandum to R.K. Lund, Vice President of Engineering, Morton Thiokol, Inkerns, July 31, 1985. Available through the National Archives and reproduced in the Rogers Commission Report, Appendix L, 23 Rogers Commission Report, Volume 1, 82 to 106. The report documents Flight 51C's blow-by data and the engineering recommendation against launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. 24 Report of the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger Accident, Volume 1, Chapter 5, 1986, 93 117 to 118. Boisjoli's "prove beyond a shadow of a doubt" language is from his testimony reproduced at 93. The Commission's formulation that NASA appeared to be requiring a contractor to prove that it was not safe to launch appears at 117 to 118. 25. Report of the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger Accident, Volume 1, Chapter 5, 1986, 93. Volume 4, Testimony of Roger Boisjoli and Robert Lund. The take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat exchange is documented in Boisjoli's testimony at 93. 26 Rogers Commission Report, Volume 1, 19 to 21, 82 to 85. The decision to launch was flawed, finding and the counterfactual assessment appear at 82 to 83. 27 Richard P. Feynman, Personal Observations on the Reliability of the Shuttle, in Rogers Commission Report, Volume 2, Appendix F, 1986. 28 Diane Vaughan, The Challenger Launch Decision, Risky Technology, Culture and Deviance at NASA, Chicago University of Chicago Press, 1996. Vaughan's study introduced normalization of deviance as a theoretical construct for understanding the institutional drift documented by the Rogers Commission. Chapter 7. 29. Securities and Exchange Commission in the matter of Wells Fargo and Company, Administrative Proceeding File Number 3-19927, February 21, 2020, paragraphs 8 to 12. The OCC Lessons Learned document referenced is Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, Lessons Learned Review, Supervision of Sales Practices and Related Activities at Wells Fargo, N.A., April 19, 2017, 4. 30. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, in the matter of Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., Consent Order Number 2, 016-CFPB-0015, September 8, 2016, paragraphs 16 to 18. The 5,300 figure refers to employees terminated for sales practices violations between 2011 and 2016. 31 SEC Administrative Proceeding 2020, paragraphs 22 to 24. Wells Fargo and Company, independent directors of the board of Wells Fargo and Company, Sales Practices Investigation Report, April 10, 2017, Board Investigation 10 to 14. 32 SEC Administrative Proceeding 2020, paragraphs 28 to 30. The term gaming was sufficiently normalized that it appeared in internal communications and training materials. 33 SEC Administrative Proceeding 2020, paragraphs 40 to 46. The Commission found that cross-sell disclosures to investors described a needs-based model that did not reflect the actual volume-based operational reality. 34 OCC Lessons Learned Review 2017, 8 to